Hey guys, tonight we're going to visit a place that feels incredibly distant now, a quiet little corner of history where life revolved around the rhythm of the sun and the demands of the soil. Imagine yourself standing there. Centuries ago, dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight, slanting down a narrow lane. The air smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and something you can't quite place. Maybe animal dung mixed with drying herbs. It's a world without smartphones, without instant coffee, where the biggest excitement might be the arrival of a traveling peddler or a calf being born. You're just there, a part of the fabric of this place. It seems peaceful, idyllic even, but rest assured, you probably wouldn't survive a week without modern medicine, sanitation, or your trusty internet connection. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking down a path worn smooth by countless generations of feet, leading toward the heart of the village. It's not a grand place, not a bustling market town you'd find on illuminated maps. This is a collection of simple dwellings, thatched roofs sagging slightly, walls perhaps wattle and daub, rough-hewn timber, or stones scavenged from nearby fields. Smoke curls lazily from a few chimneys, hinting at evening meals being prepared, probably something involving root vegetables and hope. There's the distant bleating of sheep, the cluck of chickens, maybe the rhythmic thud of a hammer from a small workshop. Life here is dictated by the seasons, by the needs of the crops, and by the unpredictable moods of nature. You wear simple, probably scratchy, wool or linen clothing. Your shoes, if you have them, are sturdy but uncomfortable. Forget comfort, you're aiming for survival, and maybe, just maybe, not smelling too bad after a hard day's work. Everything in this village revolves around necessity. Food comes from the fields and the livestock. Warmth comes from the hearth. Society comes from your neighbors. Whether you like them or not, you're pretty much stuck with them. And water. Water is the absolute linchpin of existence. For this village and countless others like it throughout history, the well isn't just a convenience. It's the pulsing heart of the community, the literal source of life. You see it now as you reach the small central square, really more of an irregularly shaped open space between houses. It's a stone structure, perhaps a low circular wall, with a wooden roof supported by rough posts to keep leaves and stray birds out. A sturdy wooden beam stretches across the opening, with a rope and bucket hanging down into the cool, dark depths. It's been here longer than anyone can remember, dug by ancestors whose names are now just echoes in the wind. The well is where you come for your morning water, for your evening water, for water to cook with, water to clean, sparingly, water for your animals. It's a constant pilgrimage, a daily ritual performed by every household. You might come with a heavy bucket, made of wood or leather, the handle rough against your hand. You let the bucket splash down, hear the satisfying thump as it hits the water below, and then the groan of the rope as you haul it back up, hand over hand, the weight increasing with every foot of rope retrieved. It's hard work, definitely not like turning on a tap. Your muscles ache slightly just thinking about it. But the water, when you finally pour it into your jug or pail, is cool, clear, and life-giving. Because the well is the center of water collection, it naturally becomes the center of social interaction. This is the original water cooler moment, centuries before fluorescent lights and passive-aggressive notes about milk. Women gather here, sharing news and gossip while waiting their turn or resting from the effort of drawing water. Men might stop by on their way to or from the fields, exchanging a few words about the weather or the crops. Children play nearby, chasing chickens or kicking a worn leather ball under the watchful eyes of the adults. The rhythmic creak of the well's pulley is a constant soundtrack to village life, as familiar and comforting as the crowing of the rooster at dawn. You learn who's getting married, who's had a new baby, whose pig escaped again, all while waiting for your bucket to fill or hauling it back up. It's the village grapevine, watered daily, quite literally. The history of wells themselves is fascinatingly deep. Humans have been digging into the earth for water for millennia, long before complex civilizations arose. Some of the earliest known wells date back thousands of years to Neolithic settlements. Think about that. Your ancestors were performing essentially the same task, using similar technology in places like Cyprus or Israel over 9,000 years ago. There's a timelessness to it, this fundamental human need to access fresh water from beneath the surface. It's a shared experience that connects you directly to people who lived unimaginably different lives in almost every other respect. The type of well you're encountering here is likely a dug well, carved painstakingly by hand into the earth, sometimes lined with stone, brick, or wood to prevent collapse. The depth would depend on the water table, the level below the ground where the soil and rock are saturated with water. In some places, this might be just a few feet. In others, it could be dozens. Imagine digging a hole dozens of feet deep with nothing but shovels and buckets, hauling up earth bucket by bucket. It required immense effort, community cooperation, and a deep understanding of the local landscape. It wasn't a task undertaken lightly. Historians still argue whether the location of early villages was primarily determined by defensive needs, arable land availability, or access to a reliable water source like a spring or well. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Did they settle near the water and then farm, or farm and then find water? Most likely it was a complex interplay of factors, but the presence of good water was almost certainly non-negotiable for any permanent settlement. No water, no village, simple as that. You can have the best fields in the world, the most defensible hill, but without water, you're just visiting. There are, of course, quirks associated with wells throughout history and folklore. Besides their practical use, wells often held spiritual or superstitious significance. They were seen as connections to the underworld, sources of mysterious power, or places where spirits resided. Wishing wells, for example, are a relatively widespread cultural phenomenon, suggesting a belief that wells were receptive to petitions or held some form of benevolent energy. In some cultures, offerings were made to wells to ensure a good supply or to appease the spirits within. You might see a few small, weathered tokens placed near the well's edge in this village, perhaps a smooth stone, a faded ribbon, or a carved piece of wood, small gestures of respect or hope. It's a practical tool, yes, but it's also more than that in the minds of the people who rely on it completely. Life here is hard, undeniably so. Work is manual and repetitive. Food can be scarce, especially during lean seasons. Illness is a constant, terrifying threat, often accepted with grim resignation. But there's also a strong sense of community, born from shared hardship and mutual dependence. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone relies in some way on everyone else, and everyone, without exception, relies on the well. It's the constant around which everything else revolves. The sun rises, you go to the fields or start your chores, and at some point, you or someone from your household makes the trip to the well. The sun sets, you gather for your evening meal, and perhaps one last trip to the well is made before darkness truly falls. You can imagine the sounds around it, the scrape of the bucket against the stone lining, the splash, the creak of the rope and pulley, the chatter of voices, the laughter of children, the occasional bark of a dog. The smell of damp earth and stone hangs in the air immediately surrounding it, contrasting with the drier, dustier smells of the village lanes. On a hot day, drawing up a bucket of cool water feels like a small miracle. You dip your hands in, feel the chill, maybe take a long drink directly from the bucket. Not advisable by modern standards, but entirely normal here. This water is life, it is health, it is the continuity of their existence. The thought that anything could ever be wrong with this source, this absolute necessity, simply doesn't compute. Why would it? It's the well. It's always been here. It's always provided. It's the most dependable thing in a world filled with uncertainty. This particular well, though, is about to become the center of a different kind of story. Not just the story of daily life and community gossip, but something else. Something that will challenge the villagers' understanding of their world, their beliefs, and perhaps even their sanity. It will go from being a simple, vital resource to something far more mysterious, far more unsettling. But for now, as the sun dips below the horizon and the air grows cool, it's just the well, the source, the heart of the village, the place where life begins each day with a bucket of water. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep in a hard bed, the last sound you hear, or perhaps imagine, might be the faint rhythmic creak of the well's pulley, pulling life from the earth's embrace. Little do you or anyone else here know what other secrets the earth might hold, just below the surface of that dark water. The sun rises again over the village, casting long shadows that slowly shorten as the morning wears on. Life continues its predictable rhythm. You rise with the light, maybe grab a bit of hard bread, and the thought inevitably turns to water. It's a fundamental part of your day, like breathing or trying to avoid stepping in something unpleasant left by a goat. So you find yourself walking that familiar path towards the well once more, bucket in hand. The air is cool and damp near the stone structure, a welcome contrast to the warming air elsewhere. The usual sounds are present, the distant lowing of cattle, the sharp strike of a blacksmith's hammer drifting from the edge of the village, the cheerful, if slightly annoying, chirping of birds. But today, there's something else mixed in with the usual symphony of rural life. It's faint at first, barely noticeable. You might dismiss it as the wind whistling through the cracks in the well's wooden roof, or perhaps the rustling of leaves in a nearby tree. It's a low murmur, like distant voices, almost swallowed by the other noises of the morning. You pause, tilting your head, trying to pinpoint it. It sounds rhythmic? No, probably just your imagination. It's early, you haven't had enough water yet. You shake your head and continue towards the well. As you get closer, the sound persists. It doesn't get much louder, but it seems to gain a strange clarity. Or perhaps your mind is just focusing on it now. It's definitely coming from the well. A low, soft sound, like someone whispering just out of earshot. Too faint to make out words, but undeniably there. You reach the well, place your bucket on the stone edge, and lean over, peering down into the dark opening. The air that rises is cool and smells of damp earth and stone, just as it should. There's the faint gleam of the water far below. You listen intently. Is it still there? Yes, a soft, sibilant sound rising from the depths. You might look around cautiously. Is anyone else nearby? Old Thomas, who spends his mornings mending fishing nets by his doorway, doesn't seem to notice anything. Young Alara is chasing a chicken near the big oak, giggling. She's clearly not hearing it. Is it just you? You pull the rope, sending the bucket rattling down the stone shaft. The sound of the bucket descending, the splash as it hits the water. These are normal, familiar sounds. But underneath them, or perhaps momentarily drowned out, you still sense that subtle murmur. As you begin the arduous task of hauling the heavy bucket back up, the sound seems to return, woven into the creak of the pulley and the strain in your arms. It's like the well itself is breathing, or perhaps sighing. You finally heave the full bucket onto the edge, water sloshing slightly over the brim. You stand there for a moment, catching your breath, listening. The murmur is still there, a soft, persistent hush. It feels odd, not threatening perhaps, but deeply unusual. Wells don't whisper, they provide water. They creak, they echo when you drop a stone down them, which you definitely shouldn't do, by the way. Someone had to fish young Finnegan's favorite pebble out last week. Took ages. They don't whisper. You grab your bucket and leave, casting a backward glance at the well. The sound seems to fade as you walk away, blending back into the ambient noise of the village. You might try to convince yourself it was just the wind, or maybe the groundwater moving in some strange way. Or perhaps you're just tired. You didn't sleep well last night. The straw in your mattress felt particularly lumpy, and that mouse was determined to chew through the larder wall. Yes, that's it. You're just tired and hearing things. But then you hear snippets of conversation later in the day. Old Man Hemlock, known for his slightly eccentric ways of he claims his prize-winning turnip talks to him, is muttering by the communal oven. You catch phrases like the well, strange sounds, like voices. Farmer Giles, a solid, sensible sort, usually only talks about the yield of his barley, but he looks troubled. Heard it myself this morning. you hear him say to his wife. Thought it was just the wind at first, but no, too regular-like. Slowly, hesitantly, other people start admitting they have heard it too. Young Mary, who fetches water for the baker, says she heard a funny humming coming from it yesterday evening. Thomas the net mender, who earlier seemed oblivious, mentions that he thought he heard something like a soft singing while working nearby. It's not just one or two people now. A small but growing number of villagers are reporting the same strange phenomenon. Low, indistinct sounds emanating from the well. Naturally, the initial reactions are varied and, frankly, quite typical of human behavior throughout history when confronted with something weird. There's plenty of skepticism. The village elder, stern and pragmatic, dismisses it entirely. Nonsense, he grumbles. Old Hemlock's turnip is talking again. That's all. It's the wind, or bats, or the water shifting. People hear what they want to hear. Others agree, attributing it to overactive imaginations, boredom, or perhaps a shared delusion brought on by a particularly bad batch of ale. Because let's be honest, some of the homebrew back then could probably make you see talking badgers, let alone hear a well whisper. This kind of collective uncertainty and varied interpretation of unusual events is a fascinating part of human history. Think of historical instances of mass hysteria, like the dancing plagues of the Middle Ages, where groups of people would inexplicably dance uncontrollably for days. While often attributed to ergot poisoning, a fungus that can grow on rye and has hallucinogenic properties, or psychological stress, the initial reactions among those witnessing or experiencing it would have been confusion, fear, and wildly different explanations, from divine punishment to demonic possession. The well's murmuring starts much smaller, much quieter, but the seeds of similar, varied interpretations are being sown. Some villagers, especially the older ones who remember local folklore and superstitions, feel a prickle of unease. They recall stories their grandmothers told them about places where the veil between worlds was thin or where ancient spirits lay dormant. The well, being a connection to the Earth's depths, feels like a prime candidate for such tales. Maybe it's a spirit trapped down there, maybe it's a warning, or maybe, worst of all, it's an omen. The sounds themselves remain elusive. No one can quite describe them consistently. Some say it's like a low hum, others a soft singing, many just call it whispering. Critically, no one reports hearing actual words, yet just the sound of speech, like a conversation happening just beyond your ability to decipher it. It's the suggestion of voices that is most unsettling. It taps into that primal human fear of the unknown, the feeling of being watched or listened to, even if you can't see or understand who or what it is. Despite the strange sounds, the water drawn from the well remains perfectly normal. It looks clear, tastes fresh, or as fresh as well water tasted back then, which, let's just say, wasn't exactly filtered Fiji water, but it was clean enough. There's no strange smell, no odd color. This is key. If the water itself were obviously tainted, the villagers would likely attribute the sounds to some natural, albeit unpleasant cause. Perhaps something rotten had fallen in, or the groundwater was churning oddly, but the water is fine. This lack of a tangible explanation makes the intangible sounds all the more disturbing. A mainstream historical fact you might consider here is the importance of well maintenance in preventing disease. In times before germ theory was understood, people didn't connect contaminated water sources directly to illness in a scientific way. However, they did understand that fouled water could make you sick. Efforts were made to keep animals away from wells, to line wells properly, and sometimes even to cover them, precisely because they knew water quality was vital. Regular cleaning, if attempted, was a massive undertaking, involving physically climbing down into the well. A dangerous job often left to specialists or the bravest, or most desperate, villagers. So, while they might not have known about bacteria, they understood the practical need for a clean water source. This makes the well's continued provision of seemingly clean water, despite the strange sounds, even more of a puzzle to them. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to wells involves dowsing or water witching. This practice, using divining rods or pendulums to locate underground water sources, has been used for centuries across different cultures. While scientifically unsupported, it persists even today in some areas. In a historical village setting like this, there might be an old villager, maybe Old Man Hemlock himself, who fancies himself a dowser. He might be called upon to examine the well, perhaps claiming the rod twitches strangely over the water, interpreting this as further evidence of something unusual dwelling within, adding another layer of folk belief to the growing mystery. Ah, he might say, tapping his chest dramatically, the rod feels agitated. The water spirit is restless. Historians still argue whether instances of perceived supernatural phenomena in historical accounts were primarily due to genuine belief in the supernatural, misinterpretation of natural events, psychological factors like suggestibility or mass hysteria, or even deliberate hoaxes. The initial reactions to the well's sounds, the mix of skepticism, natural explanations, wind, water movement, and superstitious fear perfectly embody this historical debate. Was the sound really there, or did the idea of it, perhaps started by one person's misinterpretation, spread through the community through suggestion and shared anxiety? It's a fascinating puzzle that parallels the one the villagers are now facing. As the days pass, the murmuring doesn't stop. If anything, it seems to become slightly more distinct, slightly more persistent, especially during the quieter hours of dawn and dusk. People start to adjust, in a way. Some try to ignore it, hurrying their trip to the well, avoiding conversation. Others become fixated, lingering longer than necessary, trying desperately to make out words, straining their ears until they ache. Children, often less constrained by adult skepticism, talk excitedly about the singing well, making up fanciful stories about who or what might be down there. The village begins to divide subtly. The pragmatists versus the believers. Those who blame the wind versus those who whisper about spirits. It's not an open conflict yet, more like an undercurrent of tension, a new topic of hesitant conversation in doorways and over garden fences. The well, once just the reliable heart of the village, is starting to become a focal point of unease and speculation. It's losing its simple, comforting familiarity. It's becoming mysterious and slightly unnerving. You find yourself listening more carefully now, even when you're not near the well. Does the wind really sound like that? Are you sure it's not just groundwater? You might even try recreating the sound yourself, a low hum or a whispered hush. But it never quite matches the quality of the sound from the well. There's something resonant about it, something that seems to come from deep within the earth itself. It's not just air moving, it feels ancient. The initial reports were just of sounds, murmurs, whispers, humming, singing, indistinct and frustratingly vague. But soon the reports will begin to change. The sounds will become clearer, and they will acquire a terrifying new dimension. The well won't just whisper, it will whisper to someone. And that's when the true strangeness will begin to grip the village. For now, though, it's just a subtle shift, a ripple of unease in the otherwise calm waters of daily life, originating from that most essential, most taken for granted place, the well, which has always given life and now seems to be holding its breath on the verge of speaking. The days turn into a week, then perhaps a little more. The low, persistent murmuring from the well has become a strange, unsettling part of the village's background noise. You almost get used to it, in the way you get used to a slightly loose floorboard or a neighbor's perpetually noisy chicken. It's there, you know it's odd, but daily life demands your attention. There are fields to work, meals to prepare, clothes to mend, taxes, probably because isn't there always some lord demanding something? You try to ignore the strange hum, focusing on the tangible tasks in front of you. You still go to the well because you have to. It's the only reliable water source. You just hurry a little more, perhaps, spill a little less water as you rush away. But one morning, everything changes. It's just after dawn. The air is crisp, the light still soft. Alara, the young girl who fetches water for the baker, is at the well. You might be nearby, perhaps heading towards the fields, or just leaving your dwelling. You hear her usual chatter fading as she approaches the well. Then you hear a sound that cuts through the morning quiet. Not the usual splash or the creak of the rope, but a sharp, startled gasp. It's followed by a moment of stunned silence, and then a low, frightened whimper. You and anyone else within earshot look over. Alara is standing frozen by the well's edge, bucket half filled, eyes wide with terror. She's trembling. Someone rushes over to her. Alara, what is it? What's wrong? She points a shaking finger at the well, unable to speak for a moment. When the words finally tumble out, they are barely a whisper themselves, ragged with fear. The well, it spoke, it said my name. Silence falls over the small group gathering around her. The soft, ambient noises of the morning suddenly seem deafeningly loud in contrast. The whispers? Yes, everyone has heard the whispers. But speaking, saying a name? That's different. That's specific. That's impossible. The initial reaction, predictably, is disbelief. Alara is young, prone to flights of fancy. She spends too much time listening to Old Man Hemlock's tales, people mutter. It was just the wind, distorted by the well structure. She must have imagined it, her own thoughts echoing, fear playing tricks. They try to soothe her, reassure her it was nothing. But her terror is palpable, raw and real. She refuses to go back to the well that day. She clings to her mother, sobbing, repeating, "It said my name, I heard it. Alara." Over the next few days, the reports, hesitant at first, begin to surface again. Not just vague whispers this time. Old Thomas, the net mender, usually so stoic, sits outside his door, looking pale. Someone asks him what's wrong. He stares into the distance, his voice low and rough. "The well," he murmurs. "This morning, while I was drawing water, I heard it, clear as day. Like someone standing right beside me, whispering in my ear, but coming from down there. It said, Thomas." Then it's young Finnegan's father, gruff and practical, not one for dramatics. He's seen near the well, staring down into it with a look of deep unease. He admits reluctantly that he heard it too, a low sound, distinct from the general murmur, forming his name. Gareth, it had breathed, almost like a sob. Suddenly, Alara's panicked report doesn't seem so easily dismissed. It's not just the imaginative child or the eccentric old man, it's solid, sensible Gareth. The fear starts to spread, a cold knot tightening in the stomach of everyone who hears these reports. The well isn't just making strange noises anymore. It's acknowledging individuals. It's calling out to them. What is it like to hear your name whispered from the earth? You can only imagine, or perhaps, terrifyingly, you might soon experience it yourself. It's described differently by those who hear it. Alara said it was soft, like a mother calling a child, but overlaid with a chilling wrongness. Thomas felt it was more like a secret shared, a sibilant, drawn-out sound that slithered up the well shaft. Gareth found it deep and resonant, less a whisper and more a quiet rumble that vibrated in his bones as it spoke his name. The quality might differ, but the clarity is undeniable. It's not the wind, it's language, albeit minimal, stripped down to the most personal identifier you possess, your name. The psychological impact is immediate and profound on those affected. Hearing your name called when no visible person is speaking is deeply unsettling in any context, even today with our understanding of echoes or technology. But in a historical setting, steeped in folklore and superstition, it feels loaded with meaning. It's an omen, a summons. But for what? Your mind races, conjuring images from cautionary tales, spirits luring people to their doom, curses laid upon a place, ancient entities stirring from slumber. You feel singled out, marked. Why me? What does it want? This event, the well calling out names, acts like a lightning rod, instantly confirming the fears of the more superstitious villagers and shaking the confidence of the pragmatists. The village elder still tries to rationalize, of course. Coincidence, he insists, though his voice might lack some of its former conviction. They heard the general laws, their minds supplied their name. Suggestibility, it's a trick of the ear. But it's getting harder and harder to maintain that stance in the face of multiple, independent reports from people of varying temperaments. The speed at which these reports spread is also a historical point of interest. In a time before mass media, news, especially news of the strange or frightening, traveled through a community by word of mouth like wildfire. You hear it from your neighbor, who heard it from their cousin, who saw Alara crying. You discuss it in the market square, over the wash tub, during evening gatherings. Each retelling might add a little detail, heighten the drama, or reflect the speaker's own fears or interpretations. This is how rumors, panic, and collective beliefs could take hold and spread rapidly through historical societies. The fact that multiple people are independently reporting the same specific phenomenon, hearing their name, adds weight and terror that a single isolated incident wouldn't possess. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the superstition of hearing your name called when no one is around. Across many cultures and time periods, this phenomenon has been interpreted as a significant omen, often a negative one. It's been linked to spirits, ghosts, fetches, doppelgangers or spectral doubles, or even harbingers of death. Hearing your name called by an unseen force is deeply ingrained in human folklore as a sign of being watched, selected, or marked for some fate. Imagine applying that historical fear to a vital resource like your village well. It's not just a spooky sound, it feels like a supernatural summons tied directly to the source of your life. The well isn't just whispering, it's claiming. Historians still argue whether the rapid spread of beliefs or panic in historical communities during times of perceived strange events was primarily due to a genuine shared experience, perhaps a poorly understood natural phenomenon affecting everyone similarly, mass hysteria or suggestibility, where the idea spreads and people convince themselves they are experiencing it too, or a complex interplay of both rooted in the specific cultural context and existing fears. Was everyone actually hearing their name from the well, or did the first few genuine instances, perhaps explainable by acoustics, if you stretch your imagination very far, seed the idea, causing others, already primed by fear and the general murmurs, to misinterpret sounds or even hallucinate the experience? This is the very question the villagers, and later historians looking back, would grapple with. It's the fuzzy line between objective reality and subjective perception when confronted with the inexplicable. The calls continue, though not constantly. They seem to happen intermittently, often when someone is alone at the well or during the quieter moments of the day. One day it's the blacksmith's wife, the next a farmer from the edge of the village. There seems to be no pattern yet in who is called, just that some people, seemingly at random, hear their name whispered from the depths. Each new report sends fresh shivers through the community. People start to avoid the well unless absolutely necessary, sending the youngest or most skeptical, though even the skeptical are starting to look jumpy. Drawing water becomes an ordeal. You approach the well with trepidation, your heart pounding. You listen intently, straining your ears. Do you hear it? Is that your name forming in the soft sounds rising from below? Every creak of the rope, every splash of the water seems potentially laden with meaning. You haul the bucket up as quickly as possible, trying not to make eye contact with the dark opening, trying not to listen too hard. When you walk away, you might glance back, half expecting to see something, anything, but there is only the stone structure, solid and silent from the outside, yet now imbued with a terrifying vocal presence. The water itself remains unchanged, still clear, still potable. This is perhaps the most baffling aspect. If the water was foul, it would be easier to understand. An evil spirit polluting the source, a curse on the water, but the water is fine. It's the sound that is the problem. It's the intelligence, or perceived intelligence, behind the sounds. The fact that it seems to know your name, that makes it truly horrifying. It's not a passive, strange noise. It's active communication, a direct address. The fear isn't just about the sound anymore. It's about what comes next. Why is the well calling these names? Is it a warning? A threat? Is it trying to lure people closer? No one knows, and the lack of answers fuels the growing panic. The villagers who haven't heard their name yet look with a mixture of pity and dread upon those who have. Those who have heard it feel increasingly isolated, singled out by this unseen force lurking beneath their feet. They might whisper among themselves, comparing experiences, trying to find a common thread, but there seems to be none. It just picks a name, seemingly at random, and breathes it into existence from the dark well shaft. The village begins to feel smaller, more claustrophobic. The reliable, comforting rhythms of rural life are being disrupted by this unsettling mystery. The well, once the social hub where people lingered to chat while drawing water, is now a place to be approached with caution and left quickly. Children are warned sternly not to play near it. The easy camaraderie of shared labor is strained by the unspoken fear that settles over every interaction. Who will be next? Will you be next? The whispering names mark a significant escalation. From ambiguous sound to specific address, the well has crossed a threshold. It has made its presence personal, and the villagers know with a certainty that chills them to the bone that this is only the beginning. The whispers are a prelude. The question is, a prelude to what? The sheer bone-deep terror of hearing your name called from the dark throat of the well doesn't just fade with the sunlight. It settles in you, a cold, damp presence that seems to seep into your very bones, much like the chill from drawing water on a frosty morning. For Alara, for Old Man Thomas, for Gareth, and for the handful of others who have reported this terrifying personal summons, life doesn't simply return to normal once the initial shock wears off. Oh no, normal is now a distant memory, a comfortable blanket they can no longer reach for. Within days, perhaps even sooner for some, subtle changes begin to manifest. Alara, the bright, chatty girl who used to skip to the well, now moves slowly, her shoulders slumped. The fear hasn't just left her wide-eyed, it seems to have drained the color from her cheeks and the energy from her limbs. She's listless, doesn't eat much, and speaks only when spoken to, her voice small and distant. Her mother fusses over her, thinking it's just the lingering shock, maybe a touch of the melancholy that can sometimes settle over young folk. She'll bounce back, you might hear someone say, trying to sound reassuring, though a knot of unease is starting to form in their own stomach. Old Thomas, whose hands were usually busy mending nets even when he was just sitting outside, now sits idle. His gaze is often fixed and far away. He complains of a persistent ache in his joints, a weariness he can't shake off. It's not the usual aches of old age, he insists. These feel different, heavier, like the weight of the world is pressing down on him. His breath seems a little shorter, his usual weathered complexion replaced by a pallor that looks unhealthy, not just tired. People attribute it to his age, the changing weather, anything but the well, because the alternative is simply too terrifying to contemplate. Gareth, the pragmatic, solid farmer, is perhaps the most unnerving case for the village. He's always been robust, the kind of man who could work from dawn till dusk and still have energy left and for the pint at the end of the day. If such things existed in this precise historical setting, consider it a metaphor for whatever your preferred evening indulgence might be. Maybe just complaining about the state of the thatch. But now Gareth is off his fields. He wakes feeling exhausted, even after a full night's sleep. He describes a constant low-grade dizziness, a feeling like his head is stuffed with cotton. His appetite is gone and he's lost a noticeable amount of weight in just a few days. His wife tries tonics, warm compresses, praying over him, but nothing seems to help. Gareth, who scoffed at ghosts and spirits, now just stares at the ceiling, a quiet fear in his eyes. He doesn't talk about the well anymore, but you know, everyone knows this started after he heard his name called. As more reports of the well-speaking names trickle in, the pattern becomes chillingly clear. It's not just coincidence. Almost without exception, the individuals who have heard their name whispered from the well shaft begin to exhibit these vague, unsettling symptoms. Weakness, fatigue, a strange paleness, loss of appetite, sometimes a persistent cough or a low fever that comes and goes. Some describe feeling restless at night, plagued by unsettling dreams they can't quite remember upon waking, but which leave them feeling drained and anxious. Others talk about a peculiar mental fog, a difficulty concentrating, a feeling of being detached from the world around them. It's not a dramatic, sudden collapse, not yet. It's a slow, insidious draining of vitality, a creeping malaise that is as frightening in its ambiguity as it is in its persistence. Imagine watching someone you know, someone you've seen hale and hearty just days before slowly fade before your eyes. Their laughter is gone, replaced by sighs. Their step is heavy where it was once light. They seem quieter, more withdrawn, as if some essential spark has been extinguished within them. And the only thing they all have in common? The well. The fact that they stood there, perhaps reaching for water, and heard that soft, impossible whisper call their name. Naturally, the village attempts to find other explanations. It must be something in the food, though everyone eats the same things. A bad batch of grain, an illness brought in by a traveling merchant, the air itself. People mutter about miasmas, that ancient idea that bad smells and corrupt air were the cause of disease. If the well water was somehow tainted, maybe it released some noxious vapor, but the water is still clear, still tastes fine. And the symptoms aren't uniform like a typical outbreak of flux or fever might be. It's this vague, draining sickness, coupled with a palpable sense of fear and withdrawal in the affected individuals. In a time when understanding of disease was rudimentary at best and non-existent regarding microscopic pathogens, such vague symptoms linked to a strange event were fertile ground for fear and superstition. A mainstream historical fact is that throughout much of human history, illness was often attributed to imbalances within the body, like the humoral theory, popular for centuries, which blames sickness on imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Honestly, sounds like a terrible cocktail party, or external non-physical forces. The idea of specific germs causing specific diseases was centuries away from being widely accepted. So if you see people falling ill after a strange event at like a talking well, your mind isn't jumping to bacteria, it's jumping to curses, spirits, ill omens, or maybe just bad luck. Like that time you tripped over a black cat on your way to market and then your best goat ran away. Clearly related, right? Probably. The quirky or fringe tidbit perfectly relevant here is the historical belief in the evil eye, or curses causing physical wasting. Across many cultures, unexplained illness, particularly a decline that didn't fit known patterns, was often ascribed to malevolent magic or the envious gaze of another person or entity. Hearing your name called by a non-human source, especially one connected to the deep earth or water, often seen as liminal spaces in folklore, would absolutely resonate with these fears. It feels like being singled out, marked by some unseen, potentially hostile force. The symptoms aren't just illness, they feel like the result of being targeted. It's not just sickness, it's a blighting of the game. You watch these people decline, and the fear within the village morphs again. It's no longer just a fear of the strange sounds, or even a fear of being called by name. It's a fear of what happens after you are called. The well isn't just whispering names, it seems to be marking people for the slow, draining illness. The line between the supernatural event and the physical consequence is becoming horrifyingly clear. This transition from auditory phenomenon to physical manifestation is the key turning point for the villagers. The skeptics lose more ground. You can dismiss strange sounds as acoustics or imagination for a while, but you can't easily dismiss a person wasting away before your eyes, especially when everyone exhibiting these symptoms heard the well speak to them by name. It's one thing to argue about what someone heard, it's another entirely to argue about what everyone can see. Historians still debate whether widespread reports of physical symptoms following strange or traumatic events in historical communities, like alleged hauntings, appearances, or curses, represent genuine, though perhaps poorly understood, physical ailments. Psychosomatic responses triggered by fear and suggestibility, or cases of mass hysteria where psychological distress manifests in shared physical symptoms. Could the intense fear of hearing their name, coupled with existing stresses of historical life, have genuinely made these people physically ill? Could the idea of being marked with the well, around the babab, through rumor and fear, have caused others to believe they were sick and subsequently manifest symptoms? Or was there some unknown environmental factor at play, perhaps a toxin in the water, though it tasted fine, which isn't always a guarantee, that only affected certain people and the sound was a coincidence or misinterpretation? This is the frustrating puzzle that remains centuries later. For you, living through it, there's no time for detached academic debate. There is only the gnawing dread. You look at Alara, Thomas, Gareth, and the others, and you see your own potential future. Every time you hear a cough, every time you see someone look a little paler, you wonder if they've been called. You start scrutinizing your own body. Is that ache in your arm new? Have you been more tired than usual? Did you just imagine that slight ringing in your ears? The anxiety itself is enough to make you feel unwell, blurring the lines between genuine sickness and the physical manifestation of terror. The people who have been called by name become objects of both pity and avoidance. Villagers might bring them food or offer help, but they do so hesitantly, keeping their distance. There's an unspoken fear that whatever has afflicted them might be contagious, or that simply being near them, being associated with someone marked by the well, might draw the well's attention to you. Social interactions begin to fray around the edges. Whispers aren't just coming from the well now. They're circulating through the village, filled with fear, speculation, and growing panic. The daily necessity of going to the well becomes an act of bravery, or perhaps folly. You approach it with a heart that feels like a trapped bird, beating frantically against your ribs. You listen with a desperate intensity, trying to discern the usual gurgles and echoes from that specific, terrifying sound that could form your name. You tell yourself it's just water, just stone, just echoes. But then you look at Gareth, too weak to lift a shovel, and you know it's not just echoes. The water itself, clear and vital, feels somehow complicit now. You need it to live, but the source feels poisoned, not by physical filth, but by malevolent sound, by a terrifying intelligence that knows who you are. You haul the bucket, spilling water in your haste, your eyes flicking nervously to the dark opening, half expecting to see something, a face, a shadow, anything. But there is only darkness and the low, continuous murmur that now feels utterly sinister. Those who haven't been called yet live in a state of hypervigilance. Every trip to the well is a test. Every sound is scrutinized. They try to accompany each other, thinking there's safety in numbers. But the well has shown it can whisper names even with others nearby. The fear isn't lessened, it's just shared. The village is holding its breath, waiting for the next name to be called, and dreading the inevitable decline that seems to follow. The well isn't just a source of water anymore. It's a lottery of dread, and the prize is a slow, wasting sickness. You just pray your name isn't drawn. The gnawing dread you felt whenever you approached the well had been a heavy cloak, but now it felt like a tightening noose. You'd watched Alara fade, Thomas weaken, Gareth become a ghost in his own home, their faces etched with that same inexplicable pallor, their bodies seemingly drained of life force by some unseen siphon. And you knew with a certainty that chilled you to the bone that this wasn't just a coincidence, not just some localized illness spreading through the village like a common fever. This was tied intrinsically, horrifyingly, to the well, to the sound, to the calling of names. The tipping point came, as it often does in such crises, not with a slow consensus, but a sudden, sharp shock. It was mid-morning, the sun already high, when young Finn, barely 10 years old but sturdy for his age, went to the well with his mother, Martha. Martha stood a little back, chatting with another woman while Finn lowered the bucket. "You weren't there yourself, but you heard the accounts," repeated breathlessly, eyes wide with terror. "They said he just froze, the rope slack in his hand. His eyes went wide, staring down into the darkness." And then, clear as a bell, even Martha and the other woman heard it. Not a whisper this time, but a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the air, and then, undeniably, Finn's name, spoken from the well's throat. Fish! He didn't scream. He didn't drop the rope. He just stood there, utterly rigid, for a heart-stopping moment. And then his legs gave out. He crumpled to the ground right beside the wellstone, his face ashen, breathing shallow and ragged. Martha screamed then, a sound that echoed through the village and probably stripped the paint off half the houses. If they had paint, which they didn't, but you get the picture. It was a really loud scream. People rushed over, but Finn was already different. The vibrant energy was gone, replaced by the familiar, terrifying listlessness you'd seen in the others. His symptoms weren't slow to appear this time. They were instant. Weakness, paleness, a strange vacant look in his eyes. The well hadn't just called him. It had struck him down on the spot. That was it. That was the moment. The fear, which had been a rising tide, became a tsunami. Seeing a child, seemingly healthy just seconds before, felled instantly after hearing his name called from the well, shattered whatever lingering doubts or desperate hopes remained. The well wasn't just potentially dangerous, it was an immediate, active threat. It was no longer a question of whether to use it cautiously, it was a question of whether to approach it at all. The decision, though not formally announced with town criers or engraved decrees, again, imagine the historical equivalent, maybe yelling across the village green, or just a shared grim understanding, was made collectively, silently, terrifyingly quickly. You stopped going to the well. Just like that. The path that had been worn smooth by generations of footsteps suddenly became a path to be avoided, skirted around, viewed with fearful glances. The well, the heart of the village's daily rhythm, became taboo. This isn't like deciding you're going to switch coffee brands because the old one suddenly tastes bitter. This is abandoning the literal source of your water in a pre-industrial, pre-plumbing world. Think about that for a second. Every drop you use for drinking, cooking, cleaning, washing, it all came from that well. Now you have to find it somewhere else. And in a village situated for convenience around that specific, reliable water source, somewhere else isn't exactly obvious or easy. The immediate consequence is a parched anxiety that has nothing to do with the well's calling. You feel it in your dry throat, the sudden acute awareness of your own dependence on water. People start rationing what they have stored in buckets or jars, the precious liquid measured out carefully, eyes wide with the sudden understanding of just how quickly it disappears. The simple act of taking a drink becomes freighted with worry. How long will this last? Where will the next bucket come from? You start looking at streams, puddles, anywhere you might find water. But the village was built where it was because the well was the best, most reliable source. Other streams might be seasonal or far away or prone to contamination. Historically, relying solely on surface water, like streams or rivers, often meant a higher risk of waterborne diseases, precisely because they were exposed to animal waste and other pollutants. Wells, when properly maintained, which, let's be honest, is a relative term in many historical contexts, but generally better than a stagnant pond, often offered more protection from immediate surface contamination. So trading the well for a stream wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially trading one unknown danger for a known, historical one, like trading a mystery illness for a guaranteed case of the runs. Pick your poison, literally. The village descends into a state of logistical panic. Teams are formed, reluctantly, fearfully, to scout for alternative water sources. They trudge through fields and woods, their movements hesitant, their eyes scanning not just for water, but for any sign, any sound that might feel wrong. They find small streams, muddy pools, maybe a spring or two. But none are as abundant, as accessible, or as clean, at least visually, as the well had been. Hauling water from a distant stream takes time and effort, time that should be spent farming, or mending, or doing all the other things needed for survival. The rhythm of life is thrown completely out of whack. The fear of the well doesn't lessen with distance. In some ways it grows. It sits there in the center of the village, silent now perhaps, but a brooding presence, a monument to terror. You can't ignore it. You have to walk past it to get to some parts of the village, or you have to make wide detours. Every time you catch sight of it, a jolt of fear goes through you. Is it watching? Is it listening? Will it call you anyway, even if you're not standing right beside it? You find yourself giving it a wide berth, averting your gaze, as if pretending it doesn't exist might make you invisible to whatever lurks in its depths. The affected individuals, Alara, Thomas, Gareth, young Finn now too, remain in their homes, isolated not just by their illness, but by the growing fear of their neighbors. People bring them what food and water they can spare, often water from the new dubious sources, adding another layer of worry, leaving it at their doors, avoiding direct contact. The lines of social connection are being strained, fraying under the pressure of fear and the practical difficulties of life without the central water source. The village isn't just sick, it's fracturing. This period marks a critical shift. The mystery has moved beyond the well itself and into the consequences of the well. It's no longer just about the strange sound, it's about the tangible, devastating impact on life. The practical problem of water scarcity merges with the existential terror of the well's power. The two become intertwined. The lack of safe, easy water is a direct result of the well's malign influence. The well has crippled the village, not just by making people sick, but by forcing them to abandon the very thing they needed most. Historically, reliance on local water sources meant that communities were incredibly vulnerable to their quality and availability. A mainstream historical fact here is that pre-modern villages and towns were deeply dependent on specific wells, springs, or rivers, and the contamination or failure of these sources could have catastrophic consequences, leading to disease outbreaks or forcing communities to relocate. There were no backup municipal systems, no pipes bringing water from miles away. Your life, quite literally, flowed from that single point. Losing it was an absolute disaster. It's like your internet goes out, but permanently, and it's also the only way to get food. Slightly inconvenient, I'd say. The search for water occupies everyone's minds. People try digging shallow pits closer to their homes, hoping to find a different water table, but the effort is often futile, yielding only muddy seepage or nothing at all. They gather rainwater, but that's unreliable and limited. They travel further and further afield to reach streams, their journeys becoming longer and more dangerous. The shared task of finding and hauling water, which used to be a simple chore integrated into the day, becomes an exhausting, all-consuming struggle. You feel the muscles in your arms ache from carrying heavier, more distant loads, and the water you bring back feels less pure, less trustworthy than what you took for granted before. The quirky or fringe tidbit that resonates here is the prevalence of water spirits and dangerous water sources in folklore across the globe. Many cultures have tales of spirits, like nixies, undines, or various river well spirits, who inhabit water bodies and can be benevolent, malevolent, or capricious. They might drown people, lure them, or in some tales bestow curses or blessings. The idea of a well that actively calls people's names and then causes them harm taps directly into these deep-seated fears of powerful, non-human entities residing in essential natural resources. It's not just bad water, it feels like dealing with a malicious water sprite who has decided your village is on its hit list. You wouldn't ignore a notice like that from your HOA, would you? Probably not wise to ignore a supernatural one either. This decision to abandon the well, born of absolute terror, fundamentally changes village life. The communal hub is gone. The daily routines are disrupted. The struggle for basic survival becomes harder. And all the while, the fear lingers, a thick fog hanging over everything. You look at the well, silent and still in the center of everything, and it feels less like an empty space and more like a wound, a festering point of fear and uncertainty. Historians still debate the extent to which localized environmental factors, social panic, and pre-existing health conditions interacted in historical outbreaks or crises attributed to supernatural causes. Was the abandonment of the well the most rational choice based on the perceived threat, or did the collective fear amplify the danger and lead to a self-inflicted hardship by cutting off their primary water source? Could the stress and malnutrition resulting from the difficulty of obtaining water from other sources have exacerbated the symptoms of those who were already unwell, perhaps from an entirely unrelated cause? These are the complex layers that modern analysis tries to peel back, but which were invisible to the people living through the immediate crisis. For you, it's simple. You don't go near the well, ever. The thought of hearing that sound, of feeling that sudden draining weakness, is more terrifying than the thirst, more terrifying than the endless trek to the muddy stream. You ration your water, you collect what you can, you worry constantly. You watch the path to the well grow slowly less distinct, less worn, as if the earth itself is trying to forget that terrible place. But you can't forget. No one can. The well stands as a silent accusation, a constant reminder of what was lost and what terrible power has been unleashed. It's a monument to fear, squat and gray in the sunlight, utterly black and unfathomable in the dark. You avoid looking at it directly, a superstitious habit born of desperate fear. You focus on the tasks at hand, the endless, exhausting search for water, the quiet despair of watching your neighbors sicken and fade. The well may be silent now, but its influence feels stronger than ever, a dark cloud hanging over every aspect of your life. The well has been abandoned, but it hasn't been forgotten, and it certainly hasn't forgotten you. The decision to abandon the well was made, not with fanfare, but with a heavy internal dread that settled over the village like a perpetual twilight. Now you live with the consequences, and they were arriving like a series of slow, agonizing blows. The immediate chilling collapse of Finn was a jolt, a stark demonstration of the well's power. But the true horror unfolded slowly, inevitably in the homes of those who had heard their names called. You watched them decline, and it was a terrifying silent process. Ilara, the baker, whose laughter had been as warm as her oven, lay in her bed, her skin the color of parchment, left too long in the sun. Her eyes, once bright and sharp, were now glazed, unfocused, drifting around the room as if she saw things you couldn't, or perhaps saw nothing at all. She barely spoke, didn't eat, and the vitality that had defined her seemed to simply seep away, day by day. Thomas the blacksmith, his hands calloused and strong, could no longer lift his hammer, his muscles wasted, his body shrinking inside his clothes. He coughed frequently, a dry, hacking sound that seemed to tear at his weakened frame. Gareth, who had always been quick with a joke, lay silent, unresponsive for long periods, roused only by gentle prodding. And young Finn, the most recent victim, lay feverish, trembling, already displaying that dreadful pallor and the vacant stare that marked them all. It wasn't like a fever that burned hot and broke, or a wound that festered and healed. This was a draining, a diminishment. It felt like something was literally being stolen from them, leaving behind only the fragile husk of a person. There were no obvious sores, no dramatic pustules. Thankfully, you thought, trying to avoid imagining that scenario. Just a terrifying, relentless fading. It was the absence of life, the slow march towards nothingness. And it was agonizing to witness from a distance, let alone if you were family living in the same house. And living in the same house became increasingly difficult. Fear is a potent wedge. The families of the afflicted became pariahs, isolated not just by the practical need to care for the sick, but by the raw, irrational fear of their neighbors. People whispered as they passed their homes, averted their eyes, quickened their pace. It felt cruel, but the fear was a physical thing in the village air, thick and suffocating. You worried that just being near those houses, those people, might somehow make you vulnerable to the well's attention, might put you on its list. It was a terrible burden of guilt and fear that you carried as you skirted their homes, leaving meager offerings of food and water at the doorstep before retreating quickly. The water, oh the water. The thirst became a constant companion, not just in your throat, but in your mind. Every moment of the day was structured around the arduous, exhausting task of getting water. The streams and puddles people had found were scattered, often far from the village center. You'd spend hours each day just walking, carrying empty buckets, then walking back, hunched under the weight of sloshing liquid that was often cloudy, sometimes tasted faintly of mud or leaves, and always felt insufficient. The ease of walking a few steps to the well, lowering a bucket, and drawing up cool, clear water felt like a distant, impossible dream. It was like suddenly having to hike 10 miles round trip just to turn on your tap. Except you don't have a tap, or hiking boots. The practical difficulties multiplied. Farming suffered. You couldn't irrigate fields easily, you had less water for the livestock, and the time spent hauling water was time not spent tilling, sowing, or harvesting. The daily routines of cooking and cleaning became monumental efforts, requiring careful rationing and constant anxiety. Washing clothes became a rare luxury, personal hygiene suffered, and a general air of grime and exhaustion settled over everyone. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was a fundamental attack on the village's ability to sustain itself. It was like the well hadn't just infected certain individuals, but had poisoned the very rhythm of communal life. The physical toll of constantly hauling water was immense. Your back ached, your shoulders were perpetually sore, your hands were raw. Children who used to play freely were pressed into service, carrying smaller containers. The elderly and infirm, who couldn't make the journey, were left even more dependent, relying on the strained efforts of others. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, unspoken tensions adding another layer to the pervasive fear. Why should you have to risk the long walk, the difficult climb down to the stream bed, just so Old Man Hemlock could have a cup of tea? But you did it because that's what communities were supposed to do. Except this community felt like it was slowly dissolving. Historians still argue whether periods of acute resource scarcity or the psychological impact of unexplained phenomena had a more profound immediate effect on social cohesion in small pre-industrial communities. Did the practical struggle for survival break down social bonds faster, or did the shared terrifying mystery create a different kind of fragile unity against an external threat? In your village, it felt like both were happening at once. A vicious cycle where fear of the well led to water scarcity, which led to hardship and isolation, which in turn amplified the fear and vulnerability. The sheer inefficiency of this new water regime was maddening. You'd see people trying different strategies, digging small, shallow wells closer to their homes, hoping to tap a different vein of groundwater, mostly yielding disappointment or stagnant, smelly water. Others tried setting up systems to catch rainwater, but this was unreliable and the water wasn't always potable without boiling, which required fuel and time, more resources you were now struggling to gather. It was a return to a more precarious, more primitive way of living, forced upon you by something utterly inexplicable. Like going from a modern fridge back to a root cellar and finding the root cellar also whispers your name and makes you feel awful. Probably wouldn't recommend it. The quirky or fringe tidbit that comes to mind here is the historical reliance on various methods for water purification without understanding the germ theory of disease. People used boiling, often for making beer or tea, which was safer than plain water, filtration through sand or cloth, or even adding things like vinegar or ash, sometimes based on folk wisdom or superstition rather than scientific understanding. You might try some of these methods now, boiling the stream water over a sputtering fire, watching the steam rise, hoping it's enough to kill whatever lurks unseen, but you didn't know what you were protecting yourself from. Was it just mud and leaves or something more insidious, something the well had somehow tainted, even from a distance? The sick continued to fade. There was nothing anyone could do. Folk remedies were tried. Poultices of herbs gathered from the woods, teas brewed from bitter roots, whispered prayers, and charms. Nothing seemed to help. The healers in the village, usually adept at setting bones or treating common ailments, were utterly out of their depth. They'd shake their heads, their faces etched with worry and helplessness. The illness wasn't like anything they had seen before. It left no obvious mark, offered no predictable course. It was just a slow, relentless ebbing away, and it was terrifyingly final. Watching someone you knew waste away like that, seeing the light leave their eyes, was soul-destroying. The isolation deepened. Children were kept close, warned repeatedly to stay away from the well path and to be careful even when playing near the streams. Gatherings that would have normally happened, market days, evening chats by the fire, communal tasks, became strained or stopped altogether. People were too tired from hauling water, too scared of being in close proximity to others who might have been near the well or near the sick. The natural human need for connection was being overridden by the primal instinct for self-preservation. The village wasn't just physically depleted, it was emotionally and socially starved. It felt like everyone was retreating into their own little fearful world, hoarding their precious, hard-won water and praying they wouldn't be next. You felt the constant low-grade anxiety, a knot in your stomach that never fully loosened. Every time you heard a cough, every time you saw someone look a little too pale, your heart would leap into your throat. Was it starting with them? Or was it just the exhaustion, the poor diet, the stress of living this way? You found yourself constantly monitoring yourself, checking your own energy levels, looking at your reflection in a rare puddle, searching for that telltale pallor. You became hyper-aware of sounds, flinching at sudden noises, half expecting to hear that low, resonant hum, that terrifying whisper calling your name from the distance. The well's silence was almost worse than its sound. It was a watchful, waiting silence. The struggle for water wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It reinforced the feeling of being under siege, of being punished. Why was this happening? What had the village done? Was it the well itself, or something deep beneath it, or something that had entered it? These questions circulated endlessly, whispered in hushed tones, fueling fear and speculation. Some people started talking about curses, about ancient evils disturbed, about retribution for forgotten sins. The lack of a rational explanation opened the door wide to superstition and dread. It's amazing how quickly you can go from worrying about soggy bread to contemplating ancient curses when your basic needs are threatened and spooky things start happening. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this is the historical link between poor sanitation, contaminated water, and the spread of disease in densely populated areas before the advent of modern plumbing and public health understanding. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses were devastatingly common. While the well sickness felt different, the calling of names, the specific symptoms, the vulnerability the village now faced by relying on potentially contaminated surface water was a historically accurate and terrifying reality. They had traded the well's unknown supernatural danger for the very real, known historical danger of drinking bad water. Progress, the sheer drain on energy, both physical and emotional, was cumulative. You were always tired, always anxious, always slightly dehydrated. The focus narrowed to the essentials: finding water, making food last, avoiding getting sick, avoiding the sick. The world outside the immediate struggle felt distant and unimportant. The future was uncertain, shadowed by the fear of illness and the ever-present problem of water. How long could a village survive like this? How many people would fade away? The village was contracting, pulling inwards. The well sat in the middle of it all, an empty heart. The path to it was slowly being reclaimed by grass and weeds, a visual metaphor for its abandonment. But the space it occupied felt larger, more significant than ever before. It was a void around which life now awkwardly navigated. It was a constant, silent reminder of the terror, the loss, the struggle, and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. You didn't go near it, you avoided looking at it, but you could never forget it was there, watching, waiting, perhaps still holding the power to utter the next name. The well sat there, silent and brooding, a constant, oppressive presence in the heart of the village, even though you gave it a wide berth. It was an absence, a void, around which your new, miserable life was forced to orbit. The struggle for water intensified, not just physically, but mentally. The initial shock and the first desperate, haphazard attempts to find alternative sources had given way to a grinding, soul-wearing routine of scarcity and effort. You were perpetually thirsty, perpetually tired, and the weight of the water buckets felt heavier each day, a physical manifestation of the burden you all carried. The streams and puddles you had found were dwindling. The weather hadn't been generous with rain, and the demands on these small, fragile sources were immense. People began to guard their discoveries jealously, leading to hushed arguments and wary glances where there had once been open cooperation. The communal spirit, already frayed by fear and isolation, was stretched thinner and thinner by the basic need for survival. You'd see someone sneaking off at dawn with their buckets, trying to get to a trickle they'd found before anyone else could drain it. It felt shameful, this competition for something so fundamental. But the alternative was going thirsty, and dehydration, you quickly learned, made everything else feel 10 times worse. It dulled your mind, sapped your strength, and made the pervasive fear feel even more overwhelming. The sickness, too, continued its slow, relentless march. Alara, the baker, was gone. She simply stopped breathing one quiet afternoon. There was no dramatic collapse, no final struggle, just a gentle ceasing, as if the last flicker of her life had simply been extinguished. The funeral was small, somber, and held at a nervous distance. People were afraid to mourn too closely, afraid the sickness lingered like a shroud. Thomas, the blacksmith, was weakening visibly, his breath shallow and ragged. Gareth was now almost entirely unresponsive, his body still, his gaze fixed on some distant point only he could see. And young Finn remained trapped in that fevered state, his parents watching over him with a silent, agonizing despair that was almost harder to bear than the sickness itself. The grim reality of death arriving in this slow, inexplicable manner added a new layer of terror. It wasn't quick like a fever or a wound. It was a gradual erasure. It made the well's calling feel like a mark for death, a slow countdown that began the moment you heard your name whispered on the breeze. It felt personal, deliberate, and utterly inescapable for those marked. And for everyone else, it created a gnawing uncertainty. Could you be next, even if you hadn't heard anything? Was the well's power something that could spread? This intensifying crisis fueled a desperate search not just for water, but for answers. Since practical solutions seemed to fail, minds began to turn to the irrational, the spiritual, the superstitious. The village elder, a woman named Maeve, who was usually the fount of practical wisdom, started talking about ancient spirits of the earth, angered by some forgotten slight. Others spoke of curses laid long ago, perhaps tied to the well's location itself. There were whispers of malevolent, fey creatures, drawn to the water, or even the wrath of displeased gods. You heard people recounting old folktales about wells and their hidden powers. Stories of wells that granted wishes, clearly not this one. Wells that were gateways to other worlds, wells guarded by strange beings. These tales, usually dismissed as children's stories, now took on a new, terrifying resonance. Was the well a natural phenomenon gone wrong, or was it something else entirely? Something ancient and powerful that had been woken up? The lack of a rational explanation was a vacuum into which all sorts of fears and superstitions were eagerly drawn. Some people, in their desperation, began performing small, private rituals. You might see someone leaving a small offering of bread or milk near the path to the well, hoping to appease whatever entity resided there. Others tied ribbons or charms to trees near the edge of the forbidden zone, primitive wards against an unseen threat. There was a frantic energy to these acts, a desperate hope that if you just found the right plea, performed the right gesture, you could somehow protect yourself, or maybe even reverse the curse on the sick. It felt both pathetic and entirely understandable. When logic fails you, you grasp at anything that offers a sliver of hope, even if it's just whispering to a rock. It's like when you vigorously shake a TV remote with dead batteries, knowing it won't work, but doing it anyway because maybe this time will be different. Probably won't help with ancient well curses, though. The village leadership, such as it was, a council of respected elders and tradesmen, found themselves increasingly divided and ineffective. Some clung to the hope of finding a new water source, organizing small, dangerous expeditions further into the surrounding wilderness. Others were paralyzed by fear, unable to make decisions, arguing amongst themselves about the best course of action while the sick faded and the water barrels emptied. Their authority, based on wisdom and experience, was undermined by the unprecedented nature of the crisis. How do you lead people against a whispering well that calls their names? There was no playbook for this. One mainstream historical fact that resonates here is how, in the absence of scientific understanding, past societies often attributed inexplicable outbreaks of illness or natural disasters to supernatural causes, divine punishment, or malevolent forces. The Black Death, for example, was widely seen in medieval Europe not just as a disease, but as a punishment from God, leading to religious processions, flagellation, and persecution of minority groups accused of poisoning wells. Ironically relevant here, though the well is doing the poisoning itself. This village's turn to superstition and spiritual explanations mirrored that historical pattern. Faced with something terrifying and incomprehensible, the human mind seeks meaning, even if that meaning is found in the realm of the supernatural. You witness the rising tide of fear and irrationality in small, chilling ways. People became suspicious of strangers passing through, worried they might bring ill fortune or be somehow connected to the well's power. Old grudges were resurrected, whispers spreading that someone's past misdeeds might be the reason for the village's suffering. Fear, unchecked, breeds paranoia and scapegoating. It was a disturbing transformation to witness in people you had known your whole life. The quirky or fringe tidbit that fits this shift in mindset is the historical belief in sympathetic magic, or folk remedies that relied on symbolic actions or materials rather than pharmacological effects. This could range from using plants shaped like body parts to treat those parts, to elaborate rituals involving burying objects or invoking specific spirits. While not directly tied to wells, the desperate acts of leaving offerings or tying ribbons reflected this deep-seated human tendency to try and influence the world through symbolic means when direct action is impossible or has failed. They were trying to speak the well's language, or perhaps the language of the forces they believed controlled it. Despite the turn to the spiritual, the practical needs remained desperate. The water search parties returned, often exhausted and demoralized. They'd found small springs, muddy pools, or places where the main river was accessible after a long, difficult trek, but nothing sufficient to sustain the entire village long-term, especially not with the added burden of carrying the water back. The energy expenditure was enormous, and the yield frustratingly small. It felt like trying to fill a sieve with a leaky bucket. Historians still argue whether severe resource scarcity or the psychological trauma of mass death and unexplained illness had a more immediate and profound impact on the social fabric of communities like this. Did the physical hardship of finding water lead faster to breakdown? Or did the shared fear and the mystery of the well create a different kind of stress that fractured trust and cooperation? In your village, it felt like the two were inextricably linked, feeding off each other in a downward spiral. The lack of water made everyone stressed and tired, which made them more susceptible to fear and suspicion, which further eroded the cooperation needed to solve the water crisis. The situation felt increasingly untenable. How long could this go on? The number of sick was slowly growing, not rapidly like a plague, but one or two new names would surface in hushed tones, people who had perhaps lingered too long near the well path, or whose houses were closest to it, or simply, chillingly, seemingly at random. And the marked ones continued to decline. Desperation began to breed reckless ideas. What if they tried to communicate with the well? What if they offered it something? What if someone who hadn't heard their name, risked going down the path, not to draw water, but to confront whatever was there? These were terrifying thoughts, usually dismissed quickly in moments of clarity, but they lingered at the edges of tired, fearful minds. The silent well was a mystery, and humans are compelled to solve mysteries, sometimes with disastrous consequences. You found yourself thinking about the well constantly, even when you were struggling with your water buckets, or trying to prepare a meager meal, or lying awake at night. Your mind would drift back to that silent, ominous presence in the center of everything. Had you heard anything, even faintly? Was that ache in your joints just tiredness or something else? Was that headache just dehydration or a symptom? You were constantly on guard, constantly self-monitoring, trapped in a cycle of fear and physical discomfort. The village felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next name to be called, the month death to occur, the most source of water to dry up. The future stretched out like a parched, empty road. There was no clear path forward, only the desperate hope that something would change, that a solution would be found, or that the well would simply stop. But it sat there, silent. Its power felt everywhere, a malevolent heart around which your broken lives were forced to beat. The emotional toll was immense. Laughter was rare. Conversations were hushed and anxious. The simple joys of village life, children playing freely, neighbors chatting over fences, communal meals, were gone, replaced by a grim determination to survive, overshadowed by constant fear and grief. You were isolated, tired, and living under a constant, invisible threat. It was a draining, soul-emptying existence, a slow erosion of everything that made life worth living, much like the sickness itself seemed to erode the lives of those it claimed. There was a growing sense of fatalism. If the well had called your name, you were doomed. If it hadn't, you were living on borrowed time, one drought or one wrong step away from potentially joining the list. This fatalism was a heavy cloak that settled over the village, stifling initiative and breeding resignation. Why struggle so hard for water if you were marked anyway? Why plan for the future when the future might not include you? You remembered the ease of life before, the simple act of drawing water from the well, the cool, clear taste of it, the effortless abundance. It felt like a story from another life, a life of naive ignorance before the world had shown its hidden, terrifying face. Now, even the memory of that ease was painful, a stark contrast to the brutal reality you inhabited. The well had taken more than just a few lives. It had taken the village's sense of security, its harmony, its hope. And sitting there, silent, it seemed to promise it wasn't done yet. The silence of the well wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken threats, a vacuum pulling sanity and hope out of the village. Your days were a blur of desperate labor, trekking miles for muddy water, tending to the sick with trembling hands, and living under the perpetual shadow of fear. The gnawing uncertainty of who might be next, coupled with the physical toll of scarcity, ground everyone down. The whispers of superstition grew louder because the whispers from the well felt utterly, terrifyingly real. Logic had failed. Practical solutions were barely keeping you alive, certainly not thriving. When survival itself becomes a daily miracle, you start looking for answers in places you wouldn't normally dare to look. This is where the truly desperate ideas began to surface, born not of reason, but of raw, animalistic fear and a primal urge to do something. Anything. The first whispers weren't about finding more water. They were about the well itself. If avoiding it didn't work, perhaps confronting it would. Perhaps it wasn't just a malicious force, but something that could be reasoned with, or even appeased. Maybe it wanted something in. What did ancient spirits or angry earth entities usually want in those old stories? Respect? Offerings? The idea of offerings started small. Someone suggested leaving food by the well path, as some had already been doing privately, but making it a village-wide act. Not a huge ceremony, just simple things. A loaf of bread, a bowl of berries, a fresh killed rabbit. A gesture of humility, perhaps. An admission that you were out of your depth and maybe whatever inhabited the well held the cards. It felt absurd, like trying to bribe a hurricane, but the desperation was so deep, even the absurd seemed plausible. What's the worst that could happen? It ignores the bread? Big deal, you were already starving anyway. It's kind of like leaving out cookies for Santa, except you're pretty sure this guy is on the naughty list. Then the ideas got darker. If simple offerings didn't work, maybe it needed something more significant, something with meaning. In times of profound crisis and fear throughout history, especially when facing an invisible, incomprehensible enemy, like plague or famine, communities have sometimes turned to extreme measures rooted in a belief that they needed to purify themselves or appease angered powers. One mainstream historical fact is the practice, in various cultures and periods, of ritual sacrifice, sometimes even human sacrifice, during times of existential threat or perceived divine wrath. This wasn't always about simple cruelty. It was often seen terrifyingly as the ultimate act of appeasement, a desperate gamble to restore cosmic balance or divert catastrophe. While thankfully not universally adopted, the idea of offering something of immense value, even a life, has surfaced in the historical record during peaks of collective panic. You heard the hushed conversations, the uneasy glances. What was the most valuable thing the village possessed? Not gold, you had little of that. Not food, you barely had enough. It was life, it was people. The idea, once whispered, felt like a physical chill in the air, colder than the drafts whistling through cracks in your walls. Sacrifice. Not just bread, something living. At first, it was discussed abstractly. Maybe an animal, a beloved pet, but the whispers always seemed to circle back to the ultimate offering. The most disturbing proposals didn't suggest sacrificing just anyone, but perhaps one of the sick. They were fading anyway, weren't they? Maybe their impending death could serve a purpose. Stop the well, save others. It was a horrifying, morally bankrupt thought, born purely out of terror, the kind of idea that crawls into your head when you've lost sleep and hope. You'd see people avoid the houses of the sick even more, not just out of fear of catching the illness, but perhaps from a subconscious, sickening urge to distance themselves from potential offerings. This was met with horror and revulsion by most. How could you even think such a thing? These were your neighbors, your friends, your family. The moral fabric of the village, already strained by fear and scarcity, threatened to tear apart completely under the weight of such monstrous suggestions. There were shouting matches, desperate pleas for sanity, bitter accusations. The council, already useless, was completely paralyzed by this. Half the elders were horrified, the other half silent, perhaps considering the unthinkable in their secret hearts. The quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to folklore concerning the guardians or spirits of wells and springs. In many traditions, these entities were powerful and capricious, sometimes demanding tribute or observance to ensure the water flowed pure and plentiful. Tales exist of spirits who could curse or bless, and whose favor had to be maintained through specific rituals or offerings, sometimes including valuable possessions or even blood. The idea wasn't necessarily about appeasing evil, but about acknowledging the immense power of the source of life and trying to stay on its good side, like trying to placate a grumpy landlord who controls your heating in winter. The tension in the village was palpable. Every gathering, every conversation felt fraught with unspoken terror and the hideous possibilities that had been voiced. You avoided certain people, those who seemed too willing to entertain the dark ideas. You clung tighter to those who, despite the fear, held on to their humanity, who argued vehemently against any talk of sacrifice. It felt like a battle was raging, not just against the well, but within the hearts of the villagers themselves. Would you succumb to the most primal fears? Or would you hold on to decency, even if it meant facing potential doom? There was also the recurring, terrifying idea of confronting the well directly, not as an offering, but an exploration. If it was whispering names, perhaps it could speak in other ways. Maybe someone could go down, peer into the darkness, see what was there. But who would dare? And what if they heard their name while they were down there? The thought was enough to make your blood run cold. The sick were proof of the well's power. You weren't just facing an object, you were facing something that could mark you for death with a sound. Historians still argue whether extreme isolation and prolonged psychological stress under threat fundamentally change human nature, revealing a capacity for cruelty, or simply expose pre-existing tendencies amplified by circumstance. Were these villagers capable of such dark thoughts all along? Or did the well's terror twist them into shapes they never could have been otherwise? In your experience, watching decent people grapple with unspeakable ideas, it felt like a terrible pressure was being applied, squeezing out the worst possibilities from already exhausted and terrified minds. You found yourself scrutinizing everyone, listening to every word. Who was quiet? Who was talking too much? Who seemed subtly different? Fear was a poison, spreading suspicion and paranoia as effectively as the sickness spread death. You felt your own thoughts becoming darker, more pragmatic in a chilling way. If the well had to be appeased, if a sacrifice was truly the only way, who would it be? You recoiled from the thought instantly, ashamed, but the fact that it even flickered through your mind was terrifying. This crisis was changing you too. The air felt heavier, thick with unspoken dread and the rising tide of desperation. The light jokes felt like distant echoes now, swallowed by the darkness pressing in. You were living in a village teetering on the edge, pushed by thirst, sickness, and the malevolent silence of the well towards choices no human should ever have to make. The path forward seemed to split into horrifying possibilities. Slow death by dehydration, slow death by the well's sickness, or the unthinkable act of sacrificing one of your own in a desperate, probably futile attempt to survive. It wasn't much of a menu. The air still felt heavy, doesn't it? Thick with the dread that had seeped in during those awful discussions about impossible choices. The raw, animalistic fear hadn't gone away, but the revulsion, the sheer horror at the thought of harming one of your own. For most, that was a line that simply could not be crossed. It was a terrible moral victory, hard won in the trenches of collective panic. But pushing away the darkest ideas didn't solve the problem of the well. It just left you back at square one, still facing the silence, the sickness, and the creeping certainty that doing nothing was a death sentence. If avoiding the well didn't work, and appeasing it with unspeakable acts was unthinkable, what was left? Only one option, really. The one that felt like walking directly into the mouth of the beast. You had to confront it, to know. Someone had to go down. The proposal hung in the air for days before anyone dared voice it openly in a gathering. And even then, it wasn't a formal decision, more like a desperate, choked suggestion that everyone instantly recognized as the only path forward, however terrifying. Exploration, not with prayers or offerings this time, but with ropes and lights. A grim, reluctant scientific expedition by people who barely knew how to read, let alone understand hydrology or supernatural entities. Who would go? That was the next agonizing question. Not the sick, obviously, not the elders, too frail, not those with young children, too vital to the future. It narrowed the field quickly. There were some who volunteered immediately, driven by a strange mix of fatalism and grim duty. Others had to be gently, painfully persuaded. You saw the quiet terror in their eyes, the forced bravery. It was like signing up for a mission to Mars, if Mars also whispered your name and gave you the flu. Gathering the equipment felt absurdly normal. Thick ropes, usually used for hauling timber or repairing roofs. Torches, precious things in these lean times, fueled with dwindling oil. Buckets, repurposed from water carrying to sample collecting. Though sample collecting sounded far too professional for what this was. It felt less like preparation and more like inventorying the sacrifices before they were made. You helped tie knots, checked the strength of the ropes, your hands trembling slightly. Every knot felt like a link in a chain stretching into the unknown, and maybe into oblivion. The day came quickly. The air was still and cold, mirroring the feeling in your stomach. A small crowd gathered, hushed and anxious, at the lip of the well. Not everyone could bear to watch. Some stayed home, praying or simply waiting for news they dreaded. The chosen few stood ready, their faces pale but set. There were three of them: a strong young man known for his climbing skill, a middle-aged woman who was surprisingly practical and unafraid of getting dirty, and an older villager who insisted on going, saying his life was closer to its end anyway, and he might as well make it useful. Talk about a grim retirement plan. You stood among the watchers, straining to see over shoulders, your heart hammering against your ribs. The well opening, usually just a dark circle you avoided looking directly into, now felt like a gaping maw. Ropes were secured to sturdy trees nearby, tested again and again. Torches were lit, casting flickering, inadequate light into the darkness below. The first person started the slow descent. You watched the rope pay out, inch by agonizing inch. The air grew colder around the wellhead. The silence wasn't total. You could hear the scrape of fabric against stone, the occasional dislodged pebble rattling down into the blackness, and the sound of your own ragged breathing. What was it like down there? What could they see? What could they hear? Mainstream historical fact alert. Throughout history, wells, mine shafts, and other deep vertical structures have often been regarded with a mixture of necessity and dread. Beyond the obvious physical dangers of collapse, poor air quality, like buildups of methane or carbon dioxide, and falling, there was often a profound psychological fear of the unknown depths. Many cultures held beliefs about the Earth's interior being inhabited by spirits, demons, or the dead, making descent a perilous journey not just physically, but spiritually. Miners historically faced not only the very real threat of cave-ins, but also superstitions about subterranean entities like knockers or kobolds, who could be mischievous or malevolent, reflecting this deep-seated human fear of the dark, unknown places beneath our feet. The fear these villagers felt wasn't just about falling, it was about what they might find waiting in that darkness. The voice of the explorer, relayed upwards by shouts, was muffled and echoing. "Cold down here! See the water! Looks dark." Not exactly Shakespeare, but every word was devoured by the anxious crowd above. The second person started their descent, then the third. 3 small lights flickering against immense darkness. It felt like watching tiny brave sparks being extinguished one by one. Hours seemed to crawl by. The ropes were their only link, the occasional shout, their only reassurance that they were still alive. You imagined them down there, peering into the inky water, their faces lit by the wavering torchlight, listening for anything. The whispers? Had they stopped? Or were they only heard by those marked? A quirky or fringe tidbit surfaces here. In Japanese folklore, particularly with the figure of the kappa, water spirits are often depicted as residing in rivers, ponds, and wells. These creatures are said to enjoy pulling unsuspecting people into the water, sometimes even demanding specific offerings to leave villagers alone or return children they've taken. While distinct from the well's name-whispering entity, the widespread fear of powerful, potentially malevolent beings residing in water sources is a recurring theme in folklore across the globe, suggesting a universal human caution around the mysterious and life-giving or life-taking nature of water. It's like every culture seems to have a story about why you shouldn't splash around unsupervised in the spooky pond. After what felt like an eternity, the first rope began to twitch, indicating someone was being hauled up. A collective sigh of relief, quickly followed by renewed tension. Were they all okay? Did they find anything? When the first explorer finally emerged, blinking in the daylight, their face was grim. Not injured physically, but visibly shaken. The other two followed, equally pale and quiet. They gathered around and the villagers pressed in, desperate for news. What did they find? What did they see? What did they hear? Their report was frustratingly sparse and yet deeply unsettling. The well was deep, deeper than expected. The water level was lower than usual, which wasn't surprising given the drought. But the water itself was strange. It wasn't clear. It had an unnatural turbidity, a sort of swirling darkness within it that the torches couldn't penetrate. They hadn't heard any distinct whispers or their own names, thankfully. But they had found something at the bottom, near the edge where the stone wall met the water. It was an object, not a rock, not debris from above. Something hard and smooth, partially submerged. They managed to hook it with a stick and bring it closer. It felt cold, unnaturally so, even down in the chilly well shaft. They couldn't identify it clearly in the dim light and couldn't retrieve it. It was too heavy or stuck. But the shape, it was irregular. Not natural, perhaps metallic, perhaps stone, with strange faint markings on its surface that didn't look like weathering. It felt wrong, it felt ancient, and it felt like it didn't belong there, like someone had deliberately put it there or something had brought it there. This discovery, or rather this lack of a clear discovery, but the presence of something deeply alien, left the villagers with more questions than answers. What was the object? Was it connected to the whispers? Was it the source of the sickness? Or just another layer to a horrifying mystery? It offered no practical help, no cure, no new source of clean water. It just confirmed that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the well, beyond a simple lack of rain or contamination. Historians still argue whether finding a tangible, albeit inexplicable object during a period of supernatural panic helps to ground the fear, shifting it from an intangible entity to a physical problem to be solved, or if it merely amplifies the terror by providing physical proof that something truly other is involved. For these villagers, seeing the haunted looks on the explorers' faces, hearing their descriptions of the dark water and the strange cold object, the fear only solidified. It wasn't just a story anymore. There was something there. The exploration meant to bring clarity only deepened the confusion and fear. The well remained silent from above, but its depths had revealed a disturbing secret. The village was no closer to safety, and the darkness they faced felt even more profound. Now that they knew it wasn't just empty space down there, it contained something, and that something seemed tied to their fate. It was less comforting than just dealing with bad luck. Bad luck you can understand. This felt deliberate. The strange object. That's what everyone talked about after the explorers were safely above ground. Not the depth of the well, not the dark water, but the thing down there. You pictured it in your mind based on the explorers' hushed, fumbling descriptions. Cold, dark, heavy, perhaps metallic, perhaps stone, with markings that made no sense. It felt less like a discovery and more like an accusation left at the bottom of their world. It was proof that the well wasn't just a hole in the ground with bad water. It was involved, actively. Attempts to understand or retrieve the object began almost immediately, driven by a desperate hope that if they could just see it, touch it, analyze it, they might find a clue. Maybe it was some ancient, forgotten mechanism they could switch off, a cursed artifact they could remove, a message they could finally read. Anything was better than the void of not knowing. But how do you study something at the bottom of a deep, dark well? More ropes were gathered. Makeshift grappling hooks were fashioned from bent tools and reinforced branches. They tried lowering torches closer, but the air down there seemed to swallow the light, or perhaps the dark water absorbed it. The explorers, still shaken but determined, tried to guide hooks down, hoping to snag the object. You spent hours at the well lip, holding a rope, watching the tension, feeling the endless frustration as the hook swung blind in the darkness, never quite catching. There were curses, sighs of exhaustion, and the ever-present chill radiating from the well's opening. Mainstream historical fact moment. Throughout history, retrieving objects from wells has been a surprisingly common, albeit dangerous, task. People lost buckets, tools, even animals down wells. Methods range from simple grappling hooks and nets on poles to more complex pulley systems and, in later eras, specialized well cleaning equipment. Sometimes, due to depth or obstruction, retrieval was impossible or prohibitively risky, leading to wells being abandoned or covered over. The struggle these villagers faced wasn't unique. The difficulty of interacting with things at the bottom of a deep, narrow shaft is a timeless problem, amplified here by the eerie nature of the object itself. It's like dropping your car keys down a drain, but the drain goes to, well, wherever this well goes, and the keys are also possibly evil. Days turned into a week. The grappling hook scraped against stone, snagged on roots, and tangled the ropes, but they never managed to grip the strange object securely. It was either too heavy, too firmly lodged in the silt and stone, or perhaps they started to whisper. It simply didn't want to be retrieved. The well seemed to actively thwart their efforts. Ropes frayed suspiciously quickly when nearing the water. A hook, once lowered, came back up twisted into a shape it shouldn't have been able to bend into. Small, unnerving things that piled up, adding another layer of dread. The failed attempts at retrieval deepened the despair. The glimpse of the object, rather than providing a target for action, just highlighted their powerlessness. They knew something terrible was down there, something connected to their suffering, but they couldn't reach it. It was like knowing the cure for a disease was locked in a box at the bottom of the ocean, and you didn't have a boat. And while they wrestled with ropes and hooks, the sickness continued its relentless march. More people developed the cough, the fever, the terrible fatigue. It wasn't just the ones who'd heard their names anymore. It seemed to be spreading through proximity, or just because the well's influence was seeping outwards like a dark stain. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It was a physical presence in every home, a cold hand touching everyone. You saw more and more vacant eyes, heard the hacking cough echoing through the quiet streets. The village, already isolated by the drought, was now further cut off by the fear of contagion, real or imagined. Nobody wanted to visit sick neighbors, not out of cruelty, but sheer paralyzing terror. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might find buried in obscure texts. Some folk traditions speak of fettered objects or prison stones submerged in water bodies, specifically wells or deep pools, intended to contain spirits, demons, or ancient evils. These objects weren't meant to be retrieved. They were anchors or seals. Disturbing them, or even attempting to, was said to risk unleashing whatever they were holding captive. While this doesn't perfectly match the villagers' situation, the idea of a strange, powerful object at the bottom of a significant water source being less about treasure and more about containment or malevolence resonates with their discovery. Maybe they weren't trying to retrieve a key, but to break a lock. The frustration boiled over. Arguments broke out. Some accused the explorers of not trying hard enough, despite their obvious exhaustion and fear. Others blamed the drought, the well itself, the thing down there, or even each other for past wrongs they imagined had angered whatever entity resided below. The veneer of unity, forged in the initial panic, was cracking under the sustained pressure of helplessness and spreading illness. You felt it too. The frayed nerves, the shortness of temper, the gnawing sense that they were doomed. Historians still argue whether communities facing overwhelming, unexplainable crises are more likely to collapse into infighting and superstition or unite in a shared purpose. For these villagers, it was a bit of both. The initial shared fear had led to collective action, the exploration. But the failure of that action, combined with the escalating crisis, was now breeding division and despair. The inability to retrieve or even properly identify the object fueled the feeling that they were up against something fundamentally incomprehensible and unbeatable, which is incredibly demoralizing when you're also watching your friends and family sicken and die. Sleep offered little escape. Your dreams were filled with dark water, cold objects, and the phantom sound of your name being whispered just at the edge of hearing. The well's silence above ground felt less like peace and more like a predator waiting. The water source they had relied on for generations had become a poisoned heart, pumping fear and sickness into their lives. Every sunrise brought the question, who else today? Who would be too weak to get out of bed? Whose name, if it were still whispering, would be called next? The object remained at the bottom, unseen but felt, a constant, malevolent weight in the darkness. They had looked into the abyss, and while it hadn't spoken their names, it had shown them something that confirmed their worst fears were real, tangible, and utterly beyond their reach. The well held its secret, and the village was paying the price. The ropes lay coiled near the well lip, damp and smelling faintly of mud and despair. Those attempts to grapple the object, to snag it and haul it into the light, felt like a lifetime ago already. The frustration hadn't just been about failing to retrieve a curiosity, it was the failure to act, to do something, to grab the source of the problem, whatever it was, and wrestle it into submission. But the well had held fast to its secret, and the village was left with only the dark knowledge that something alien and cold lay at the bottom, possibly the poisoned heart of their unfolding tragedy. And the tragedy was unfolding with terrifying speed. The cough became more wrenching, the fever hotter, the fatigue a crushing weight that stole the will to even sip water. It wasn't just the ones whose names had been whispered anymore. The sickness was a wildfire now, licking at every door. A child too young to understand names lay listless in their mother's arms. A strong farmer who'd scoffed at the whole well-whispering business now shivered under a pile of blankets, his breath ragged. Fear, cold and sharp, had replaced the initial confusion and dread. You moved through the village like a ghost, keeping your distance, eyes scanning faces for the telltale flush, the watery eyes, the shallow, rattling breath. The silence in the homes of the sick was punctuated only by harsh coughing fits. The usual sounds of village life, hammering, distant laughter, the lowing of cattle, had faded, replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the wind and the constant, unspoken question hanging in the air. Why? Why the well? Why the whispers? Why the sickness? And always, the silent answer seemed to point down, into the darkness where the object lay. Mainstream historical fact. Throughout history, when faced with widespread, inexplicable illness, communities often looked for a tangible source or a supernatural cause. Poisons were suspected, contaminated water sources were feared, often rightly so, and malevolent forces, curses, demons, angry gods, were frequently blamed. Responses ranged from isolating the sick, early forms of quarantine, though often brutal, to religious rituals, seeking out scapegoats, and trying every available remedy, no matter how strange or ineffective. The villagers' instinct to connect the sickness to the well and the strange object aligns perfectly with historical patterns of human behavior when confronted with the terrifying unknown of an epidemic. It's morbidly fascinating how consistent our panic strategies are, even across millennia. You'd think by now we'd have learned to just wash our hands. Theories abounded, whispered behind cupped hands. The object was a curse placed there centuries ago by a jealous neighbor village or an angry spirit. It was a physical manifestation of the whispers, a kind of dark echo chamber amplifying their power. It was leaching poison into the groundwater, though no one could explain why the water tasted fine before they stopped drinking it. Some remembered old stories of objects dropped into wells as offerings to ensure good water. And perhaps this was an offering gone horribly wrong, or a failed attempt to placate something ancient that now demanded more. A quirky or fringe tidbit to chew on. In some ancient and medieval belief systems, wells were seen as gateways to other worlds, not just sources of water. They could be places where spirits resided, where oracles spoke, or where powerful, sometimes dangerous entities were contained. Offerings were often made to the spirits of the well, and disturbing such a place, especially if it contained something unusual or sacred, was believed to have dire consequences, sometimes affecting the land or the people connected to it. The idea of this well being more than just a hole with water, but a place linked to deeper, stranger forces, echoes these old beliefs. Maybe it wasn't just bad plumbing. Maybe it was a leaky boundary. Despair gnawed at them. They couldn't get the object out, and they couldn't drink from the well. The stored water dwindled. Searching for new sources in the bone-dry landscape felt increasingly futile. The sick needed care, but who dared go near them? The healthy were exhausted by fear and the effort of finding any drop of potable water. The whispers, if they continued, were drowned out by the sounds of illness and the rising tide of panic. You felt trapped, the village an island of suffering in a sea of drought. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of prolonged, unexplained crises on small, isolated communities. Does shared adversity forge stronger bonds, or does it reveal existing fault lines and drive people to turn on each other? In this village, both dynamics were at play. There were acts of quiet heroism, neighbors leaving food on doorsteps, people risking exposure to check on the very ill, from a distance mostly. But there was also suspicion, blaming, and a palpable sense of isolation as families retreated into themselves, fearing interaction. The inability to fight the sickness, coupled with the frustrating mystery of the well and the object, was a potent cocktail for social breakdown. It turns out helplessness isn't a great foundation for community spirit. The object remained below, a silent, unseen antagonist. Its nature was a complete mystery. Was it natural? Unnatural? Did it have properties that amplified sound, causing the whispers? Did it emit some unseen miasma? Was it simply a focal point for whatever was happening, rather than the cause? The questions circled endlessly, leading nowhere. Without being able to examine it, they were just guessing in the dark, literally and figuratively. They knew the well was involved, and they knew something was down there. But the connection to the sickness remained a terrifyingly obscure puzzle. The village had hit a wall. Retrieval failed. Understanding felt impossible. The only certainty was the sickness spreading like a shadow. What could they possibly do next? What could they possibly do next? When reason fails and fear takes hold, logic tends to pack its bags and head for the hills. The villagers, cornered by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't understand, began to grasp at anything at all that promised a flicker of hope, no matter how outlandish. You watched as the initial, relatively sensible responses, staying away from the well, trying to retrieve the object, devolved into something far more primal. First came the rituals. The elder, a man whose eyes held the weary resignation of someone who'd seen too many bad harvests and too few good solutions, led the charge. He spoke of ancient protections, of appeasing angry spirits, of cleansing the land. They gathered at the edge of the village, far from the curse of the well, and performed a ceremony involving smoke from burning herbs that smelled vaguely of burnt socks and desperation. They chanted words you didn't understand, words that felt ancient and heavy with a history you weren't privy to. They poured small offerings of milk and grain onto the parched ground, a poignant gesture in a place where both were becoming precious resources. You stood on the periphery, observing the mix of fervent belief and naked fear on their faces. It felt less like a genuine spiritual act and more like a frantic attempt to bargain with the universe. Okay, we'll do the spooky smoke thing. Just make it stop. Next, the blaming started. It's an almost inevitable step in any crisis where the cause isn't clear. Someone must be responsible, right? It can't just be random bad luck or a germ. There were whispers about the newcomer family who'd arrived last year. Maybe they brought a curse? There were accusations directed at the village outcast, a solitary woman who lived on the edge of the woods and kept to herself. Perhaps she was a witch, casting a spell? The air thickened with suspicion, adding another layer of tension to the already unbearable situation. You saw neighbors who had shared meals and laughter for decades now eye each other with distrust. Fingers pointed, voices rose, and the fragile bonds of community frayed further under the strain. It's a classic pattern. When facing an external threat, people often turn inward and find internal enemies. Because let's be honest, it's easier to yell at your weird neighbor than to yell at an invisible disease or a silent object at the bottom of a well. They tried physical remedies based on old folk wisdom, most of which felt questionable at best. Poultices made of questionable swamp herbs, concoctions brewed from things you really shouldn't drink, charms worn around the neck that looked suspiciously like dried animal bits. Someone insisted that sleeping with an onion under your pillow would ward off the sickness. You smelled a lot of onions in the village for a few days. Did it help? Probably not, unless the sickness was allergic to pungent vegetables. The historical record is full of these kinds of desperate cures during epidemics. Everything from wearing plague masks stuffed with herbs, which might have offered minimal protection from airborne droplets, but mostly just made you look like a terrifying bird, to bloodletting, purging, and consuming all sorts of substances that likely did more harm than good. The logic, if there was any, was often based on humoral theory, balancing bodily fluids, or sympathetic magic, treating symptoms with things that resembled them. It highlights humanity's persistent need to do something, anything, even if that something is utterly useless or even counterproductive. A mainstream historical fact here. Throughout history, public health responses to unknown diseases were often a mix of empirical observation, like isolating the sick, which did work to some extent, and superstition or unproven remedies. The Black Death, for instance, led to early forms of quarantine in some places, but also saw people trying everything from flagellating themselves to consuming powdered emeralds. The inability to see or understand microorganisms meant that explanations defaulted to divine wrath, astrological alignments, or bad air, miasma theory, leading to treatments that address these supposed causes rather than the actual biological one. The villagers' actions, from rituals to folk remedies, mirror this historical pattern of scrambling for any explanation or cure in the face of an invisible killer. The well itself became an increasing focus of this desperate energy. Since they couldn't retrieve the object, they started trying to contain whatever power it had. They built a makeshift barrier around the wellhead, a flimsy fence of branches and rocks that looked less like a containment structure and more like a sad attempt to keep rabbits out. They painted strange symbols on the stones around the well, symbols that no one seemed to recognize, but which someone claimed were ancient wards against evil. They even tried pouring purifying substances into the water. Vinegar, strong-smelling herbs, things that probably just made the water taste worse, not less cursed. It was like watching someone try to put out a house fire with a teacup, a quirky or fringe tidbit that comes to mind. Historically, folk beliefs about water sources often involve specific rituals or substances used to purify or bless them, especially if they were thought to be tainted by malevolent forces. In some traditions, iron was believed to ward off spirits, so iron objects might be placed near wells. In others, specific prayers or incantations were used. There are even scattered historical accounts of people attempting to seal wells believed to be cursed or haunted. While the villager's fence might seem comical to a modern eye, the impulse to physically interact with and try to neutralize a suspected source of danger through symbolic or unproven means is a deeply ingrained human behavior, especially when facing an invisible or supernatural threat. They were essentially trying to exorcise the well. Amidst the panic and increasingly bizarre attempts at control, there were glimmers of resilience, though they were overshadowed by the spreading sickness. People still tried to care for their families, still shared what little water they had with close neighbors, from a safe distance, of course. But the overall mood was one of despair and reactive, often irrational action. The inability to deal directly with the problem, the object, the sickness, led them to flail against the symptoms, the fear, and each other. Historians still argue about the point at which desperation in a crisis turns a community from functional, if struggling, into chaotic or self-destructive. Is there a specific trigger? Is it a slow erosion of morale? In this village, you felt that tipping point approaching. The sickness was accelerating. The well remained a dark enigma, and their attempts to combat the situation felt increasingly futile, driving them to more extreme and illogical measures. The energy previously channeled into trying to understand or retrieve the object was now being spent on frantic rituals and baseless accusations. It was the energy of panic, not of problem solving. You heard people whispering about leaving, about abandoning the village altogether. But where would they go? The surrounding lands were dry and unwelcoming. The sickness was likely already carried by some. Leaving felt like trading one kind of doom for another, slower one. So they stayed, trapped by geography, by the spreading illness, and by the terrifying mystery of the well and the object that lay unseen at its bottom. They were throwing everything they had, rituals, blame, dubious remedies, physical barriers, at a problem they didn't comprehend, and none of it seemed to be working. The whispers, if you still listened carefully, seemed almost to mock their efforts, faint and indifferent below the rising tide of fear and coughing. The murmuring from the well didn't cease. It lingered in the air around the stone structure, a soft, persistent current of sound that the villagers gradually integrated into the background noise of their lives, much like the distant bleating of sheep or the rhythmic thud of the mill. You'd pass by and hear it, that low, sibilant hum, and mostly try to ignore it. It was like a persistent, quiet fly that you could shoo away from your immediate attention, but you knew it was still buzzing somewhere nearby. The initial shock began to wear off for some, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance of the village's peculiar new feature. "Oh, that's just the well acting up again," you might hear someone say with a shrug. But the nature of the sound wasn't static. As the days turned into weeks and the oddness became less new and more normal, unfortunately, something subtle started to shift. The indistinct quality of the murmur began to lessen. It wasn't becoming louder, not necessarily, but it felt more focused, like turning a blurry image just slightly until the edges sharpened. The whispers still weren't clear enough to form full sentences, but the tones seemed to gain definition. There was still that soft, watery hiss, but woven into it were sounds that, to a listener straining their ears, began to resemble the cadence of human speech more closely than ever before. Then came the day when the reports changed from "it sounds like voices" to something far more specific and, frankly, chilling. It started, as these things often do, with someone who was perhaps lingering a little too long by the well, trying to decipher its secrets, or maybe just lost in thought while drawing water. Imagine young Alara again, no longer chasing chickens, but standing by the well, pulling up a bucket for her mother. The murmuring is there, as always. She's mostly ignoring it, her mind on the loaf she needs to bake or the thread she needs to spin. But then, out of the low hum, a sliver of sound seems to rise distinct from the rest. It's soft, so soft she almost misses it, but it's unmistakable. Not just a hum, not just a whisper, a sound shaped like a name, her name, Alara. It seems to breathe from the depths, just once, a gentle, almost tender sibilance rising on the cool, damp air. Alara freezes. Her hands stop pulling the rope. The bucket hangs suspended over the dark shaft. Did she just imagine that? The wind? The sound of the water itself? She listens intently, her heart beginning to thump a little harder in her chest. The murmur is still there, but it slips back into its indistinct quality. She strains to hear it again, to make out the sound that just seems so terrifyingly clear. Nothing. Just the general, unsettling hush. She finishes drawing her water quickly, her movements jerky. She glances around. No one is close enough to have possibly whispered it. Her face is pale. When she gets back to her mother, she's shaking slightly. "Mother," she whispers, her voice trembling. I heard something strange at the well." Naturally, her mother, pragmatic and busy, initially dismisses it. Nonsense, child, you're imagining things. Hurry now, the oven is hot. But Alara insists, no, mother, I heard it. It sounded like someone whispered my name. From the well. This is where the unease truly begins to morph into fear. Vague whispers are one thing. Hearing your actual, specific name called from a dark, deep place is quite another. It's personal. It feels targeted. And soon, Alara's experience isn't an isolated incident. Old Thomas, the net mender bum, is by the well, carefully washing some finished netting. He's mostly deaf in one ear, which has perhaps made him dismissive of the earlier general murmurs. But today, as he's rinsing a particularly naughty section, he hears it, a soft sound, surprisingly clear despite his hearing. Thomas. He drops the netting back into the bucket. He looks around wildly. Who's there? The well is empty of people save for himself. He peers down into the well shaft. Nothing but darkness and the faint gleam of water. The sound doesn't repeat, at least not clearly. But he heard it, his name. Farmer Giles, hauling bucket after heavy bucket to water his young seedlings, pauses for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow. He leans against the cool stone of the well. The murmur is present, a constant companion now. He sighs, wishing it would just stop. And then from the depths, softer than the sigh of the wind, he hears it. Giles. He jumps back, startled. He looks behind him, scanning the path. No one. Just the buzzing insects and the distant calls of the fields. His eyes widen. His name. These weren't just random sounds anymore. The well, or whatever was in it, was apparently starting to address people directly, and it was using their names. The claims spread through the village like wildfire, far faster and with more credibility than the earlier vague reports. Alara heard her name. Thomas heard his. Giles, too. Skepticism didn't vanish entirely, of course. Some insisted it was mass delusion, or that the individuals were cracking under the pressure of the ongoing strangeness. They want to hear their names, the elder might scoff. So they do. It's the wind shaped by expectation, which honestly is a fairly sophisticated psychological argument for someone who probably believed bad humors caused illness. So points for trying. Others suggested people were simply misinterpreting the sounds, hearing patterns that weren't there, imposing meaning onto random noise, a phenomenon known as apophenia, seeing meaningful connections in meaningless data, like seeing shapes in clouds, but instead of a fluffy bunny, it's your own name being whispered from a hole in the ground. Much creepier. But it was becoming harder to dismiss. 3 people, all reporting hearing their specific name, and not just any 3 people, but people of different ages, different temperaments, different levels of prior credulity regarding the well's sounds. Alara was young and perhaps impressionable, but Thomas was old and somewhat curmudgeonly, and Giles was as solid and grounded as the earth he tilled. Their testimonies carried weight, the fear amplified tenfold. Why these names? Was it random? Or was there a purpose? What did it mean when the well called your name? Was it an invitation? A warning? An omen? This led to intense speculation and, predictably, panic among those whose names hadn't been called yet. You'd approach the well, bucket in hand, with a new level of dread. Would it call your name today? Part of you probably wanted to hear it, just to confirm it was real, to be part of the strange phenomenon everyone was talking about. But a much larger part of you was absolutely terrified of hearing it, because who knew what it meant? You'd dip your bucket quickly, pull it up even faster than before, and hurry away, straining your ears not just to hear if it whispered, but to hear whose name it might call next. The communal anxiety was palpable. People who had heard their names became objects of intense and sometimes fearful scrutiny. Villagers would eye Alara, Thomas, and Giles with a mixture of pity and suspicion. What made them special? What did the well want with them? Had they done something to attract its attention? This taps into a fascinating aspect of historical folk belief and the way communities dealt with unexplained phenomena. In many historical cultures, particularly before scientific explanations for things like disease or strange occurrences became widespread, events that defied understanding were often attributed to supernatural forces, spirits, or divine demonic influence. And often these forces were perceived as having specific targets or motives, perhaps related to a person's actions, their family lineage, or some hidden aspect of their life. If the well was calling names, it must have a reason, and that reason was likely tied to the individual being named. This created a terrifying potential for self-blame or community suspicion. Was the well calling your name because you were somehow marked or cursed? A mainstream historical fact related to this period and setting is the prevalence of strong, often isolationist village communities. Life was hyper-local. Your entire world was often defined by the boundaries of your village in the nearby fields. Everyone knew everyone and everyone's business. This close-knit structure could be a source of strength and mutual support, but it could also be a breeding ground for gossip, suspicion, and shared anxiety when unusual events occurred. The well's whispering didn't happen in isolation. It happened within a crucible of intense social interaction and interdependence. News, fear, and rumor spread rapidly through face-to-face conversations, amplifying the effect of the strange occurrences. A quirky or fringe tidbit that fits here involves the power attributed to names in various historical cultures. In some beliefs, knowing a person's true name gave you power over them. In others, names were seen as intrinsically linked to a person's soul or destiny. The idea of a non-human entity, like a well knowing and using someone's specific name, would have been deeply unsettling. It suggested an intimacy, a level of awareness, and potentially a claim over the individual that was profoundly unnatural and frightening. It wasn't just a random sound, it was a recognition, a specific address that felt both invasive and portentous. Historians still argue whether the rapid spread and specific nature of claims during periods of perceived supernatural events, such as hearing voices, seeing apparitions, or experiencing physical symptoms attributed to curses or spirits, were primarily driven by genuine shared psychological experiences, perhaps triggered by environmental factors or collective stress, or if suggestion and social reinforcement played a dominant role, with people unconsciously or consciously modifying their perceptions to fit the prevailing narrative. The wells named whispers are a perfect example. Did Alara, Thomas, and Giles genuinely hear their names because something specific called them? Or did the general anxiety and the idea of the well whispering names prime their brains to interpret indistinct sounds in that way? And once the first person claimed it, did it become easier for others to hear their own names through suggestion? It's a fascinating unresolved question about the nature of perception, belief, and social dynamics in historical contexts. As more names were whispered, a new layer of panic set in. Was there a list? Was the well working its way through the village roster? Whose name would be next? People began avoiding the well if they could, sending children or trying to time their visits for when others were around, as if strength in numbers might deter the unseen presence. You'd find yourself whispering your own name under your breath, testing the sound, comparing it to the imagined whisper from the well. It felt surreal, like living in a strange dream. The water itself remained stubbornly, bafflingly normal. Still clear, still cool, still life-sustaining. This contrast between the tangible, mundane reality of the water and the intangible, terrifying reality of the whispers only deepened the mystery. If the water was poison, you could explain it. If there was a dead animal down there making odd sounds, you could explain it. But clean water and whispering names? There was no simple explanation that fit within the villagers' understanding of the natural world. The calling of names wasn't constant. It was sporadic, unpredictable. Sometimes hours would pass with only the familiar, indistinct murmur. Then suddenly, during a quiet moment, someone else's name would be breathed from the depths, sending a fresh wave of fear through the village. Young Finnegan, the pebble dropper from before, reportedly heard his name while being scolded by his mother near the well. Even the grumpy village elder, who publicly scoffed at the tales, was rumored to have gone pale and silent after a morning trip to the well, though he denied hearing anything but the wind, rather too vehemently to be entirely convincing. The whispered names weren't just sounds, they were psychological intrusions. They invaded the personal space of the individual, making the well's presence feel intimate and menacing. It was no longer just a strange phenomenon happening at the well. It was a strange phenomenon reaching out to people, and the question loomed larger than ever. What would happen next? What came after the well called your name? This wasn't just boring history anymore. It was history holding its breath, waiting for the next terrifying whisper to rise from the dark. The fear that had settled over the village after the names began to be whispered was thick and heavy, like damp wool on a foggy morning. People moved with a new caution around the well, their eyes darting nervously towards the dark opening whenever they had to approach. You'd find yourself holding your breath, listening intently, half dreading, half morbidly curious if your name would be the next sound to escape the depths. The air was charged with anticipation, but not the good kind, more like the hushed tension before a storm breaks. Then came the storm. It started subtly, as many tragedies do. Thomas, the old net mender, the one who was a bit deaf in one ear but insisted he'd clearly heard his name whispered from the well just a few days prior, didn't show up at his usual spot by the river. This wasn't entirely unheard of. Old men had aches and pains, and sometimes the weather was just too unpleasant. But when young Finnegan was sent to check on him later in the day, he found Thomas in a state that quickly extinguished any lingering doubts about the well's intentions. You walk with Finnegan to Thomas's small cottage on the edge of the village. The door is ajar, which is unusual for careful Thomas. You push it open gently. The air inside is close and smells faintly of sickness. Thomas lies on his small cot, bundled in blankets despite the mild air. His face is pale, his skin seems clammy, and his eyes are closed, fluttering occasionally as if he's trapped in a troubled sleep. You approach cautiously. "Thomas?" Finnegan says softly. Thomas stirs with a weak groan. He opens his eyes, but they seem unfocused, distant. He mutters something you can't quite make out, something about the well, or maybe just a fevered rambling. His breath is shallow, his forehead hot to the touch. He is clearly unwell. This isn't just an old man having a bad day. There's a strange weakness about him, a listlessness that feels different from a common cold or a sore back. His skin has a peculiar, almost translucent pallor, and his eyes hold a glassy, unfocused look that sends a shiver down your spine. You've seen sickness before, plenty of it in a place like this, but something about this feels wrong. Finnegan, scared but trying to be brave, rushes back to the village center to report what he's found. The news spreads instantly. Old Thomas is sick. The first person whose name was reported, whispered from the well, is sick. The connection is made immediately, intuitively, horribly. It clicks into place in everyone's minds with the chilling certainty of a lock snapping shut. The well called his name, and now he is sick. It wasn't just a strange noise. It was a summons, or a mark, or a curse. Panic begins to ripple through the village. It moves from the hushed fear of the unknown to the stark terror of a known, immediate threat. If Thomas, who heard his name, is sick, what about Alara? What about Giles? What about anyone else whose name might have been whispered that hasn't been reported yet? What about you if you were one of the unlucky ones? The village elder, who had scoffed so loudly at the whispered names, is now visibly shaken. He organizes visits to Thomas, not out of medical expertise, they have none beyond poultices and herbal teas, but out of communal duty and desperate concern. They try their usual remedies: warm drinks, cool cloths for the fever, comforting words. Nothing seems to help. Thomas remains weak, drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing increasingly labored. This event highlights a significant aspect of historical village life: the lack of medical knowledge and resources. In this era, before germ theory, before antibiotics, even before a solid understanding of basic hygiene, sickness was a frequent, often devastating visitor. Diseases that we now consider minor could sweep through a community with terrifying speed and lethality. When someone fell ill with mysterious symptoms, particularly after an unusual event, explanations often turned to the supernatural: curses, evil spirits, divine punishment, or corrupted heirs. Miasma. There was no concept of invisible pathogens spreading from person to person. Illness was often seen as an individual misfortune, sometimes linked to sin or exposure to harmful forces, rather than a contagious process. The villagers' first reaction is not to quarantine Thomas. That idea is largely absent in widespread practice at this time, although some historical communities did instinctively isolate the clearly contagious. especially during obvious plagues. Their reaction is fear and superstition. What kind of sickness is this? Is it the well's sickness? Is it contagious? Or is it something that only affects those marked by the well? This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. The historical belief in hexes or curses specifically tied to places or objects. Throughout history, there are countless examples of folklore linking illness, misfortune, or death to touching a specific stone, drinking from a particular spring, sometimes perceived as haunted or sacred in a negative way, or disturbing a burial site. The well, having already proven itself unusual by whispering names, easily fits into this framework of a place imbued with a malevolent, or at least dangerous, supernatural power. The sickness is not from the well physically, in their minds, but sent by the well, a direct consequence of its attention. As Thomas's condition worsens over the next day or two, the fear intensifies. People who heard their names, Elara, Giles, perhaps others who had kept quiet out of fear or disbelief, are now observed with terrifying vigilance by the rest of the village. Are they starting to show symptoms? Every cough, every pale face, every moment of fatigue is interpreted as a possible sign that the well's sickness is taking hold. You might find yourself nervously checking your own reflection, looking for signs of that strange pallor, feeling your own forehead for fever. Had you lingered near the well recently? Had you heard anything at all that might have been mistaken for your name? Doubt and paranoia are insidious, creeping into even the most rational minds when faced with something utterly inexplicable and terrifying. The village is now in a state of low-grade panic. Drawing water becomes a fraught task. Some propose digging a new well, but that is a massive undertaking, expensive and requiring expertise they don't possess. Others suggest sealing the well, but what if the sickness comes from the water itself, drunk over years? And what if sealing it traps whatever malevolent force is down there, making it angrier? There are no easy answers, only terrifying possibilities. Historians still argue whether periods of intense collective stress, like that caused by a perceived supernatural threat or a mysterious illness, could manifest in psychosomatic symptoms across a population. Did some villagers feel sick, exhibit pallor, or experience headaches and weakness simply because they were utterly terrified and convinced they were next? Or was there an actual physical illness spreading, perhaps triggered or exacerbated by environmental factors in or around the well, or even an unrelated contagious disease that the village was quick to attribute to the well due to the timing of events? It's difficult to untangle the threads of mass psychology, environmental factors, and actual pathogens in historical accounts like this. Old Thomas doesn't recover. Despite the villager's best efforts, his weakness deepens. He stops speaking altogether, his breaths becoming shallow gasps. Within 3 days of being found ill, he passes away quietly in his cot. His death is a devastating blow, confirming the villagers' darkest fears. The well didn't just whisper names, it marked people for death. The casual murmur, the chillingly personal call, they were prelude to this. The first victim has fallen, and the village knows, with a sinking certainty, that he will not be the last. The question is no longer if the sickness will spread, but to whom it will spread next and how quickly. And the terror is now palpable, a cold, heavy blanket smothering any hope of returning to normalcy. The air around you feels thinner now, colder, even when the sun is high. Thomas's death wasn't just a loss, it was a dark confirmation. The well's whisper wasn't a prank or a hallucination. It was, in the eyes of the village, a death sentence whispered into the ear of the condemned. And the terror that had been simmering now boiled over, scalding the community with fear and suspicion. Who would be next? The answer came swiftly. Elara, the baker's daughter, the one with the bright laugh who had reported hearing her name while fetching water just a few days after Thomas, didn't show up to knead dough one morning. Her mother found her in bed, displaying the same frightening symptoms: pallor, weakness, a listless gaze, and shallow breathing. Then Giles, the taciturn woodcutter, a man known for his strength and stoicism, suddenly couldn't lift his axe without trembling. He, too, had confessed to hearing his name whispered from the depths. Within days, more fell ill, It wasn't a slow creep, it felt like an ambush. Panic became a tangible thing, a fog that settled over the lanes and into the cottages. The well, once the heart of the village, became a place of absolute dread. People avoided it entirely. They'd travel extra distances to the small, less reliable stream further out, or ration stored water, anything to avoid drawing from the place that seemed to be actively killing them. You walk through the village, and the usual sounds are muted. Laughter is rare, replaced by anxious murmurs and the muffled sounds of coughing. Doors are kept shut, and neighbors eye each other nervously. Had they been near the well? Had they heard something they hadn't reported? The illness seemed to strike randomly among those who had heard their names, or perhaps there were others who had heard but were too terrified to admit it now. Was it contagious? The village had no real concept of contagion in the way we understand it today, but they saw the pattern. Thomas got sick, then Alara and Giles, then others. They linked it not necessarily to breathing the same air or touching surfaces, but to being in the vicinity of the well, or perhaps simply being marked by it. Desperation set in. The village elder, his face etched with worry lines deeper than ever, called a meeting, huddled around a meager fire, even though the weather wasn't cold. What could they do? Prayers were offered, pleas directed to any higher power that might be listening. Some suggested rituals, ancient folk practices meant to ward off evil or appease angry spirits. Offerings were debated. What would satisfy a well that whispered names and brought sickness? Jewels? Food? A sacrifice? Thankfully, that last idea was quickly shut down, though the fact it was even mentioned shows the depth of their fear. One popular idea, born of sheer terror, was to fill the well in, dump stones, earth, anything into it until the whispers were silenced and the water source was gone. But others argued passionately against it. What if the sickness was in the water they had already drunk? What if burying the well just angered whatever entity resided there, making the outbreak worse? And how would they survive without a reliable water source for drinking, cooking, and cleaning? Historians still argue whether the spread of illness in communities experiencing supernatural panic is solely attributable to known pathogens, psychosomatic reactions amplified by fear, or potentially environmental factors overlooked by historical accounts. Was the well somehow contaminated with a natural, albeit potent, toxin or pathogen that was exacerbated by specific conditions? Or was it a combination of a mild, unrelated illness passing through the village, its effects magnified by mass hysteria and fear, leading people to interpret normal ailments as signs of the well sickness? It's hard to distinguish between a genuine outbreak and a community literally scaring itself sick during times of inexplicable crisis. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the historical reliance on sympathetic magic and folk remedies tied to the perceived cause of illness. And if the well was believed to be the source, remedies might involve avoiding well water, wearing amulets made from stones found away from the well, or performing rituals at a distance from the well, hoping to sever the connection. They might try poultices of herbs known to counter bad humors or corrupted air, totally missing the point if the cause was bacterial or viral. Imagine trying to fight the plague with a charm against grumpy spirits. Probably not your best strategy, even if it made people feel like they were doing something. You witness the toll the sickness takes. It's not always fatal, at least not immediately. Some recover after a period of severe weakness, left pale and gaunt, forever marked as someone who survived the well's call. Others, like Thomas, simply fade away. The village gravedigger is kept busy. Every funeral is a somber, terrifying event, a stark reminder of the invisible threat that stalks them. The whispers from the well seem to become less frequent as the sickness peaks. Was the entity satisfied? Had it moved on? Or were people simply too terrified to go near enough to listen anymore? The silence from the well isn't a relief, it's just another layer of dread. Is it dormant, waiting? Or has its work been done? The village reaches a grim equilibrium. The sickness continues to claim lives for a time, but eventually, it seems to wane. Perhaps it burned through the most vulnerable. Perhaps those who survived developed some form of immunity, or perhaps the underlying cause. Whatever it truly was, dissipated. Life, or a semblance of it, has to go on. People adapt. They find new ways to get water, new routes to avoid the well, and a shared, unspoken trauma binds them together. The well remains, a dark, silent scar on the landscape. No one approaches it willingly anymore. Its mouth, once welcoming, is now a gaping maw of fear. The whispers are gone, but the names they called and the sickness they brought are etched forever into the memory of the village. You, having lived through it, carry that same scar. The sound of your name, even spoken kindly by a friend, can sometimes bring a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. The well may be silent, but its legacy of fear whispers on in the back of your mind. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As the final whispers of the story fade, feel yourself drifting, gently letting go of the tension that the tale may have stirred. The village, the well, the fear, they are now safely held within the realm of the P, historical echoes that need not follow you into the present quiet. Your body feels heavy and relaxed, settling deeper into your resting place. The anxieties of the day recede like a tide, leaving behind only calm and stillness. You are here, safe and warm, the sounds around you soft and lulling. Just breathe, slow and deep, allowing sleep to wrap around you like a comforting blanket, pulling you away from the waking world and into the peaceful dark. There is nothing left to do now but surrender to the quiet, letting your mind become still and peaceful as you drift towards dreams.